advised that we have a quorum, and I call to order the fourth session of the fall special town meeting. Before we get down to business, let me make a couple of remarks about skip that. All right. We have, before we get into the articles, we have 3 motions to defer until a later date, Articles 27, 28, and 34. The reason for these motions to defer are that the supplements relating to these articles did not make the final paper mailing and had to be distributed electronically. And they changed the nature of each of these articles significantly, so that we have been asked to defer them to give town meeting members more time to assimilate these late changes. So I'm going to have 3 motions for deferral. The first is to defer Article 27 to this coming Thursday, December 3, where it will be taken either right after the CPA article, Article 12, or if we haven't reached Article 27 this evening, it'll be taken in the order in which it appears in the warrant. So this is a motion to defer Article 27 to Thursday evening. I remind you that you have 45 seconds to vote. The screens will drop into your computers, and you press either yes, no, or abstain. The voting period has commenced. Motion to defer Article 27 to Thursday, December 3. Moved by Ms. Cunningham, by the way, and seconded. Voting period is over. People on the phone, as usual. Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones?
Yes, yes.
Ms. McNally?
McNally, yes.
The count, please.
160 yes, 9 no, 8 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 162 in favor, 9 opposed, and 8 abstentions. The next deferral motion relates to Article 28, to defer Article 28 to Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, December 2. It's moved by Ms. Cunningham. Is there a second? Someone please second the motion. Thank you. There is a second. Yes. All right. The voting period is commenced. Motion is to defer consideration of Article 28 to Wednesday, December 2, where again, it will be taken either as the first item of business, or if we don't reach it this evening, in the order in which it appears in the warrant. Period is terminated. Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Ms. McNally,
Yes. McNally, yes.
could I have the count, please?
181 yes, 10 no, 7 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 183 in favor, 10 opposed, and 7 abstentions. Finally, motion to defer Article 34 to Thursday, December 3, and the advisory committee requests that Article 34 be dealt with prior to Article 27. Moving party is Ms. Pelkey. Is there a second? Motion is seconded. All right, the has commenced. This is a motion to move defer consideration of Article 34 until Thursday, December 3, at which time it will be dealt with immediately prior to our dealing with Article 27. No, it'll be dealt with prior to. Voting terminated. Mr. Jones,
Yes.
Ms. McNally,
McNally, yes.
count please.
158 yes, 42 no, 6 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 160 in favor, 42 opposed, and 6 abstentions. Ms. Pelkey,
Yes, Mr. Moderator, I believe you had that motion backwards. The request was to have 34 taken up after 27, not before.
okay, if that's fine with me, and if there's any change in that order, we can deal with it when we reach those articles on Thursday evening. All right, before we start, let me just say a few words about points of order. A point of order should be an unusual motion because it can interrupt the speaker, and I have to interrupt the speaker to take a point of order. What a point of order is not is someone rising to dispute a statement that's been made by a prior speaker, even if it's a dispute of facts. If you have an argument with a prior speaker, you line up with everybody else on the list of people that wish to address town meeting. It does not constitute a point of order. With that in mind, let's turn to our first article of the evening, which is Article 18. The main motion under Article 18 is found in the gray supplement number 2, page 1. It's moved by Ms. Levine, seconded by Mr. Ananian. The advisory committee moves a substitute motion on the yellow supplement number 1, page 1 over to the page 2. It's moved by Mr. Sandman, seconded by Mr. Friedman, and the speakers to this motion will explain the differences between the two. I call on Ms. Levine and Ms. McLellan to present the petitioner's motion. Yes, Megan. Well, they'll, yeah, you can unmute both of them. Ms. McLellan, Nicole Mcclellan, Precinct 11. Ms. Levine, whenever you're ready.
I'm Megan Levine, town meeting member from Precinct 3 and one of the lead petitioners for warrant Article 18. This article does not ask you to decide whether you personally support ranked choice voting. It does not ask you to debate whether ranked choice voting makes sense for all elected positions in Brookline. And it does not ask you to evaluate the validity of studies that show ranked choice voting gives voters more voice. Voting favorable action on warrant Article 18 simply says that you believe we should study this issue further. This article asks the select board to appoint a committee to study the possible implementation of ranked choice voting for municipal elections in Brookline. Specifically, warrant Article 18 instructs the select board to appoint a committee to study and issue a report by fall 2021 on the following: equipment needed if Brookline were to implement ranked choice voting, ballot design options for ranked choice voting, recommended time frame for implementation, budget recommendations for funding required. And by the way, the town clerk has already said we need to replace our voting machines. You may have noticed you have two versions of warrant Article 18 in front of you, the petitioner's version and the advisory committee's version. The articles are very similar except for one clause. The AC version also tasks the committee to study whether or not to adopt ranked choice voting. In the petitioner's view, this additional clause could potentially shift the decision-making power from town meeting and the voters to a small committee. The intent of the study committee is to fact-find, research, engage in public process, and to report findings back to the select board and town meeting. It will be up to town meeting, and most importantly, the voters of Brookline, to decide whether or not we should adopt ranked choice voting. Let's leave whether or not out of the main motion and keep the decision-making powers with town meeting and the voters. Even though I've been familiar with ranked choice voting for a while, I always find it helpful to have a brief explainer on ranked choice voting. So here's Nicole.
Thank you, Megan. I'm Nicole Mcclellan, town meeting member, Precinct 11. Ranked choice voting is an electoral system that allows people to vote for multiple candidates in the same seat in order of preference. So instead of just choosing who you want to win and only weighing in on one candidate per slot, you fill out the ballot to reflect who's your first choice, second choice, third choice, etc. for each position. Ranked choice voting can be used for single winner or multi-winner elections. The process for the voter is essentially the same. It's important to note that if a voter only wants to vote for one candidate and not rank them, they can still do that with ranked choice voting. The way the results are tallied with ranked choice voting is if a candidate wins an outright proportional majority right off the bat, so for one seat that's open, if they win more than 50%, if it's two seats, more than 33%, et cetera, then that candidate wins. But if no candidate gets more than the majority of first choice votes, then the candidate with the fewest first choice votes is eliminated. And for those ballots, the second choice votes are tallied. In other words, if you ranked a losing candidate as your first choice and the candidate is eliminated, your vote still counts. It just moves to your second choice candidate. That process continues until somebody has a majority of the votes and that person is the winner. Now, that tabulation might sound complicated, and if you were a poll worker in Cambridge in the 1940s, hand counting ranked choice vote ballots and doing the math, it would have been. But fortunately, technology has come a long way in 80 years, and now we have voting software and algorithms, and for basically any computer, this is really like preschool math. Nationwide, we're seeing more municipalities switch to ranked choice voting as their electoral system, and there are several reasons for that. I'll go over those briefly. First and foremost, fundamentally, ranked choice voting ensures majority support. With ranked choice voting, whoever is favored by the broadest majority of voters wins, and avoids an outcome where a winner is the last choice of a majority of voters, as does happen, as we know, with plurality voting. Ranked choice voting expands voter choice. Voters don't have to worry about voting strategically with ranked choice voting because there's no spoiler effect, and vote splitting among several popular candidates isn't an issue. This means voters can vote their true first choice without worrying their vote will be wasted or that it will advantage their least favorite candidate. Ranked choice voting has been shown to disincentivize negative campaigning and have a depolarizing effect. Negative campaigning is basically not rewarded with ranked choice voting. A candidate wants to be a voter's first choice, of course, but if they're not the first choice, they'd kind of like to be the second or maybe even the third choice. So they're incentivized to aim for broad appeal. And comprehensive polling.
Ms. McLellan, Mr. Rosenthal has a point of order. Mr. Rosenthal?
trying to unmute there. I'm sorry, I think this is a point of order. I could have waited for Ms. McLellan to finish, but
Well, I
question is,
wish you had. Who are you?
oh, Marty Rosenthal, Precinct 9. I was just trying to figure out when you said some colored page, for those of us that are looking at the combined reports online, they're all white, and I'm colorblind anyway, but my question is, I'd like to know what the difference that I'm trying to listen to people, what the difference is that I'm trying to listen for.
Well, you've already been told by Ms. Levine what the difference is, and you will hear 7 other speakers focus on that difference. So let's go back to Ms. McLellan.
How much time do I have left?
You have 1 minute and a half.
I was saying that ranked choice voting has been shown to disincentivize negative campaigning and have a depolarizing effect. And comprehensive polling has shown that voters in elections where ranked choice voting is used experience more positive and constructive campaign messages versus in plurality voting. Ranked choice voting helps equalize the playing field for historically underrepresented candidates. So there have been several studies that have shown that in ranked choice voting areas, women and people of color both run more often and win more often than in areas that don't use ranked choice voting. And finally, it mitigates the problem of wasted votes in mail-in elections or elections with longer voting cycles. So if you mail in your ballot and then your favorite candidate that you voted for dropped out, your vote still counts. It just goes to your second choice. And if you're wondering if this could really make a difference in our little local elections, when you look at the data about the past 15 to 20 years of town elections, there have been multiple instances in which a candidate has been elected with less than a proportional majority support. In fact, in most of our contested select board races, the winner or winners have won without a proportional majority of the vote. Ranked choice voting is a compelling electoral system worthy of our consideration. We have seen it contribute to better democratic processes and higher voter satisfaction in other cities and towns. We have seen that voters are open to it in Brookline with the recent statewide vote where 65 to 70% of Brookline voted in support. And now is the time to do our homework and undertake a serious study of ranked choice voting. Please join me, a 4/5 majority of the Select Board, the Brookline Commission for Women, CDICR, on first voting no on the Advisory Committee amendment, and then regardless of that outcome, voting yes on the main motion for Warrant Article 18. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Rosenthal, for your benefit, I also, in addition to announcing the color of the supplement, if it happened to be copied and distributed, I will also announce the number of the supplement, which you will find in the upper right-hand corner of each supplement. So the main motion is on supplement number 2 under this article, and the advisory committee's substitute motion is on supplement number 1. Ms. Westfall?
Christine Westfall speaking for the advisory committee. To reiterate, the main difference between the advisory committee motion and the main motion is that the advisory committee included language that had the select board committee study whether or not to adopt ranked choice voting. The committee itself would not adopt or not adopt ranked choice voting, but we felt that it was important that the committee be able to consider whether or not ranked choice voting made sense in Brookline, particularly for town meeting member elections, which would be somewhat complex because there are usually multiple candidates running. Ranked choice voting is really easy when there's going to be a winner. It gets more complex, and a number of advisory committee members were familiar with the Cambridge system, which required fairly sophisticated mathematics. Now, it's true that we can program a computer to do that. We're just not sure that it makes sense to go forward without at least asking the question, how would it work here? And do we want to do that? And would they recommend that? It's not that we're suggesting that the committee itself would make that decision, but we feel that the committee ought to be free to ask the question, does this make sense? the same report out has to happen whether you choose the advisory committee's motion or the main motion. If you look at what you're expected to receive from the committee in terms of a report, it's virtually the same. But we want to give the committee the ability to ask the question, should ranked choice voting be adopted in Brookline, and make a recommendation about that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez.
Raul Fernandez, Select Board member, speaking for a majority of the Select Board in favor of the petitioner's motion. We've talked many times at town meeting about the need for more inclusive engagement in local politics in Brookline. While Brookline residents are certainly opinionated, many of their voices are woefully underrepresented at the ballot box. Low voter participation rates in municipal elections, as low as the single digits in recent years, and many uncontested races for townwide offices and even some town meeting precincts are just two examples of underengagement in one important aspect of the political process, elections. This body recently passed a warrant article expanding the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds, in part as a means to inject new life into our local politics. We continue to wait on approval from the state legislature on that home rule petition. Two warrant articles we'll be taking up later this session would provide compensation to certain townwide officials as a means, the petitioners will argue, to make those offices more accessible. And here in that same spirit, we have warrant article 18 on ranked choice voting. The board agrees with the petitioners and a strong majority of Brookline voters that ranked choice voting could encourage more people to participate in local elections and may encourage candidates to run for office who might otherwise not. Particularly candidates who are passionate about raising important issues, but who fear that running may take away votes from another viable candidate. More broadly, the board believes that ranked choice voting will encourage greater and more inclusive civic engagement. That said, this isn't a done deal, and we still need some answers to important questions. Questions like, what kind of equipment will we need? How might our ballots be designed? How long will it take to implement this, and how much might it cost? The petitioner's motion would create a process by which we can get those answers and present them for full deliberation, vote, and implementation later down the line. By a vote of 4-1, the Select Board recommends favorable action on the petitioner's motion and encourages you to do the same. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman. Harry Friedman.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Harry Friedman, Precinct 12. Tonight you have before you two seemingly similar propositions. However, they differ in two important details. Detail 1, the petitioner's motion asks that town meeting authorize a study regarding the implementation of a ranked choice voting system for Brookline. The petitioners have already made the decision that a ranked choice voting system is desirable. Again, the study they want town meeting to approve is one of how best to implement. On the other hand, the advisory proposal authorizes a study on whether or not a ranked choice voting system is even desirable. If the study finds it to be a desirable proposition, implementation decisions could or would come later. Detail number 2, the ranked choice voting proposal here is not the one on which we voted in the November state election. That proposal was for the adoption of ranked choice voting in certain single winner contests. The proposal before you tonight includes multi-winner contests. Most Brookline elections, such as those for school committee, town meeting, and the select board in 2 out of every 3 years, are multi-winner contests. What difference does that make, you might ask? The petitioner's whereas clauses cite the system used in the city of Cambridge as the one we might model. So let's look at how these elections are conducted in Cambridge. How do they work? Number 1, you first need to determine the threshold. This is the number of votes that if you get them, you are declared an elected winner. The threshold is determined by dividing the total number of valid ballots cast by the number of positions to be elected plus 1, and then adding 1 to the resulting dividend. Thus, to elect 9 city councilors, the total number of valid ballots cast is divided by 10, then 1 is added to the result of the division. For example, if 25,000 valid Ballots are cast for the 9-member city council. 25,000 is divided by 10, and then you add 1, resulting in a threshold of 2,501. That's the easy part. You then need to count the ballots. Voters rank their choices. Anyone who reaches the threshold with votes ranking them number 1 is declared elected. This is the first count. In single winner ranked choice contests, lower ranked candidates are eliminated until a winner is declared. Votes flow in one direction, from those eliminated to those remaining. However, in multi-winner ranked choice contests, votes flow in 2 directions. Votes over the threshold amount for winning candidates, called surplus votes, get distributed to lower ranked candidates, while votes of those who are eliminated are redistributed to candidates still in the race who have yet to meet the threshold. For candidates that reach the threshold, their surplus votes gets redistributed. Ballots are then counted. Ballots continue to flow back and forth, and eventually the 9 winners are declared. So what are the issues with this? Number 1, citizens have a right to know and understand something as basic as how their voting system works. Ranked choice voting in multi-winner elections is mind-numbingly complex. One of the reasons it lost at the state level was that people did not understand it. However, the state proposal was only for single winner elections. In those elections, explaining how ranked choice voting works is a piece of cake compared to multi-winner elections. Issue 2, we have just been through an election where there have been cries of voter fraud and exhortations to count every vote. Can you imagine the atmosphere if some kind of ranked choice voting had been in place? Voters need transparency. The counting of ballots in a multi-winner ranked choice system is as far from transparent as you get. It is a black box, inexplicable to all but a few. 3, in the way that Cambridge counts the votes, there is an element of chance. If the threshold is 5,000 and a candidate has 7,000 number 1 votes, 2,000 votes are surplus. They get distributed to lower ranked candidates. But which 2,000? Well, all 7,000 have the same candidate ranked as number 1. They have a variety of different candidates with lower rankings. Very few ballots may be the same or similar. The 2,000 that get redistributed in Cambridge are chosen randomly. What does this mean? Take all the paper ballots, count them, then throw them up in the air and recount them. In a current Brookline election, if a recount is done, the results will be the same as the original count. If 10 recounts are done, the results will be the same each time. In a single winner ranked choice system, no matter how many times one does a recount, the results will always be the same. However, the way Cambridge does multi-winner ranked choice counts, the results will vary every time one does a count. Take all the ballots counted on Tuesday, throw them up in the air, recount them on Wednesday, and the results will be different because different ballots will be considered surplus and redistributed. It is true that other cities and towns in the Commonwealth use or have used or will use ranked choice voting in multi-winner elections. Cambridge does it. Amherst and East Hampton will start in 2021. But that means that 348 cities and towns don't use ranked choice voting. There's a good reason for that. The petitioners have the cart before the horse. If ranked choice voting is proposed, you first study it to see if it's an idea worth considering. Then you determine how best to implement. You don't study how best to implement something you may later decide not to do at all. Please support the advisory committee's substitute motion. And finally, if the whole idea of ranked choice voting in multi-winner elections appalls you, then vote against whichever is the final motion. But let's have the advisory committee study be the one in which we vote up or down. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ananian?
Hello, Scott Ananian, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 10. I have slides. There they are, great. Like I said, I'm Scott Ananian, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 10. We're talking about warrant Article 18. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There you go. So again, warrant Article 18 forms a select board study committee to study the following 4 things: recommended equipment, ballot design recommendations, a recommended time frame for implementation, and budget recommendations. Next slide, please. First, let me give you what an election warden or a poll worker would see in terms of how an election is currently conducted and how it would be conducted in RCV. Next slide, please. So these are the machines we currently have. They're AccuVote OS machines. They're optical scan paper ballots, which have some very nice properties in terms of reliability and verifiability and auditability. They were purchased in 2001 with a 10-year warranty. However, the model stopped being made in 2007. And they're well past their warranty now. Town clerk has recommended replacement at a cost of about $130,000 for some very good reasons. We also use AutoMark ballot marking devices to improve accessibility here. So the time is ripe for this article. The machines have to be replaced, so it is the time to discuss what we are going to replace them with. Next slide. There are 2 machines currently certified by the state that can be used in ranked choice voting elections. These are already approved by the Secretary of State. They're both optical scan paper ballot machines, just like we have today, voter verifiable, auditable. This first one is very similar to the machine currently used by the town. If you notice, the main difference is that it has a larger screen. If you've ever voted and had your ballot kicked back, and then the warden had to come over and stare at a little 2-line LCD to figure out what was wrong, this has a much nicer process for that. It can tell you clearly what was wrong and what you need to fix. These machines are used in Maine to conduct their ranked choice elections. Next slide. The other main choice is ImageCast Precinct. This one was purchased by Arlington, and actually Cambridge replaced their AccuVote OS machines with these. Also approved by the Massachusetts Secretary of State. Also optical scan paper ballots. Next slide. So sample ballot, again, this is straightforward. You fill in column number 1 with your first choice, column number 2 with your second choice, column number 3 with your third choice. You don't have to rank every candidate. Folks have been doing this in Maine and Cambridge for a while. It's not hard. Next slide, please. So central tabulation. This is the part which Harry Friedman is so excited about. This is the often overlooked part of town voting. It happens in town hall after polls close. Observers are welcome. In the old days, Cambridge RCV tabulation was by hand. That's because their ranked choice voting system was adopted in 1948, I believe, and you did not have computers that could be used for this. These days, there's 3 main options, and discussing the pros and cons of these is part of what the committee would be charged with doing. It happens in moments so that the results are still audible, repeatable, verifiable, and Harry Friedman is excited apparently about auditing them and making sure that the results are reproducible. Next slide, please. What the resolution says again, next slide. Again, recommended equipment, ballot design recommendations, a recommended time frame for implementation, which presumably will have to do with how long it will take to acquire the equipment, to train staff, to do new procedures, and the budget recommendations for the funding. So the guidance for budget is fiscal year 22 so that we can have some input into our upcoming capital improvement plan. Doesn't necessarily mean that those machines would be bought in fiscal year 22, just that we don't want to go ahead with buying machines until we have some guidance as to what the right time frame for replacement is. And this is necessary for any use in RCV in town elections. So whether you want a single winner election, whether you want to do this in multi-winner elections, if you're going to use RCV in any election for constable or whatever, then you need to have machines that can support it. You need to have some idea of how it's laid out in the ballot. You need to know the time frame to do it, and you need to know the budget. And so this is the first step needed for any use, whether you like, whether you dislike it for town meeting members or you dislike multi-winner elections or whatever. If you need it in any race anywhere in town, you need to study these things. Next slide, please.
30 seconds.
Thank you. So next slide. There's going to be plenty of discussion and plenty of time of public process and town meeting votes and discussion about this. One path, if the town meeting votes favorable action on Article 18 tonight, we still have the select board appointing a committee with participation from the town clerk's office and the public. Budget guidance final report, there will be a home rule petition drafted. Town meeting will vote on that. State legislature will vote on it. Possibly there will be a townwide vote on it. So there is plenty of time to get into the details. That's not what this article is about. Next slide, please. In my final 2
please
seconds.
conclude, Mr. Nanian.
Yes, this is my conclusion slide. So join the Select Board, the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, and the Brookline Commission for Women. Vote no action on the AC amendment to keep the committee focused on the facts for the future TM policy debate, which we will have. and vote favorable action on the main motion to recommend the best equipment, ballot design, timeframe, and budget for ranked choice voting in town elections. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Daly. Nancy.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes.
Yep.
This is Nancy Daly, Precinct 12. I just wanted to say I have some concerns about ranked choice voting in town elections. I think it's pretty tough to run for a town-wide race in Brookline. It's expensive, it takes a lot of time, and generally the candidate, and if they're lucky, maybe a family member and one or two friends are helping them. And so it becomes a very onerous task to figure out all the stuff you have to do, fundraise, get signs up, go to all the events, etc. I think it's hard enough to figure out how to try to win a race like that without having to figure out how you become a lot of people's number 2 vote, as well as becoming some people's number 1 vote. And so I am going to support the advisory committee alternative for those reasons.
Thank you, Mr. Stone. Danny Stone. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Danny Stone, Precinct 10. Ranked choice voting is something we already do in our daily lives. For example, if my friend is stopping by Trader Joe's, I might ask her to get me some chocolate ice cream. And if they don't have chocolate, I'll take vanilla or strawberry instead. In the same way we rank ice cream preferences, we can rank candidates on a ballot. This is what ranked choice voting is. It's not mind-numbingly complex, as Mr. Freeman argued earlier. Ranked choice voting makes sense, and it's a popular idea in Brookline. In the election on November 3rd, Brookline voters favored the ballot question overwhelmingly by 70%. People like it because it's honest. If we can list our preferences and know that our vote will be counted, we don't need to engage in what some have called strategic voting, or voting for who we think can win. This is mind-numbingly complex. These mind games are complicated and unhealthy for democracy, which is why I'm asking my fellow town meeting members to vote favorable action on the main motion. Voting yes will allow us to study the question and learn how ranked choice voting can work here in Brookline. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Krewinghaus. Krewinghaus.
All right, great. Hi, David Crowinghouse, town meeting member from Precinct 11. I moved to Brookline 5 years ago from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Back in 2008, the voters of Minneapolis chose to adopt ranked choice voting for all city elections, including single seat and multi-seat elections, which are held 3 out of every 4 years in a cycle. So they've already used ranked choice voting for many elections. In the beginning, some voter education and poll worker training were required, but when they held their first ranked choice voting election in 2009, there was only one spoiled ballot in the whole city. In the past 11 years, voter turnout has increased in every election, in every ward. 85% of polled voters found ranked choice voting easy to use, 68% wanted to continue using it in future elections, and 70% wanted to see it used in state elections where it's never been an option. More women are running for office and more are getting elected, leading to better balance on the city council and to the second female mayor in the city's history. More people of color are running for office and are getting elected. People of color currently represent nearly 40% of the city council. Negative campaigning has been reduced noticeably. And from personal experience, I know that ranking my choices is super easy and intuitive. Computers do the hard math, so I don't have to. But having said all that, this article is not about the benefits of ranked choice voting. This article is about forming a committee to gather data, measuring before we cut, you might say. Brookline must carefully look at the RCV details for Brookline's races before deciding if we want this or not. Let's give an educated answer to the question, which requires the study proposed in this warrant article, so that when we actually debate ranked choice voting in Brookline, we'll know how much the machines cost, we'll know what the ballot design could look like, and we'll know how long implementation is likely to take. I urge you to vote no action on the advisory committee motion and to join the majority of the Select Board, the Commission for Women, and the CDICR in voting favorable action on the main motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bernstein.
Good evening, Michael A. Bernstein, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 12. There are 3 elections that I will never forget. The presidential election of the year 2000, the Minnesota governor race of 1998, and the famous Brookline school committee race of 2009. To refresh your memories about this, the presidential race of 2000 was one in which, had a ranked choice voting system existed, we probably would have had a different result. That election, actually, at the time, I was teaching a math class, and my students were very interested in the mathematics of voting and the benefits of ranked choice voting and other voting systems. And I introduced them to what had happened in Minnesota in 1998, where a minority of voters had chosen Jesse Ventura and a majority had chosen one of the other 2 candidates. And had there been a ranked choice voting system in place, the majority could have picked a second choice, and there would have been an actual candidate that would have much more support who had been elected. In Brookline in 2009, folks might remember that we had a school committee race in which we had 2 incumbents, Judy Myers and Ira Chan, and 1 empty spot for somebody who chose not to run for re-election, and 2 candidates, Barbara Scotto and Elizabeth Childs, chose to run. Well, as you know, we have what is called a plurality at-large voting system currently in Brookline, where you fill out the number of dots equal to the number of candidates who you wish to support. And the problem is that this leads to a bullet voting situation. So during that race, you had many voters who liked Barbara Scotto or liked Elizabeth Childs. And many of them bullet voted one of those 2 candidates, thinking, well, everybody knows that Judy Myers and Ira Chan will get reelected. I want to make sure I support this one challenger. And thank you. And as many of you may or may not remember, Ira Chan lost. And at the time, that meant we lost, I think, the only non-white member of the school committee at the time. The fact is that if we had a ranked choice voting system in Brookline at that time, all of these voters could have put either Barbara Scott or Elizabeth Childs as their number 1 choice, Judy or Ira as number 2, and chances are very likely we would have kept the 2 candidates that everybody wanted, because after Ira lost, many people who did bullet vote said, oh, I didn't mean for this to happen. I think given what we're already dealing with in how popular ranked choice voting is in Brookline and how we're going to be looking to buy the machines for ranked choice voting, I think it's prudent of us to support the petitioner's motion. And I hope others will join me in doing the same. The last thing we want is Jesse Ventura running Brookline.
Thank you. Ms. Fisher? Shana?
Hi.
Shira.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, I'm Shira Fisher, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 11. I want to briefly address a few misunderstandings about ranked choice voting that you may have heard, and I just sent an email to the town meeting listserv so you have all the references for all of the citations that I'm going to point out. So in brief, some people say that it's too hard to use ranked choice voting. It's not any more complicated than ranking your favorite ice cream, which other people have noted, or sports teams. Polling in San Francisco, Maine, and Santa Fe all found that most voters find it easy to do. And if you don't know any of the candidates, you can just skip them, which you can do in current elections as well. And we know that in Brookline, people skip questions, skip voters all the time. There's a myth that RCV is costly. In truth, it's actually often cheaper because there's no need for runoffs or even primaries, and implementation has not been shown to be expensive. For example, in Maine, and I have a link in the email, we're also at a point of needing to buy new machines, but we should find out how much it would cost before we decide whether or not to move forward. There's a myth that ballot exhaustion is a major problem, that people don't rank enough people for their votes to count, and that it affects lower income or lower education people more. In truth, there are many ways for votes to be wasted, but researchers have found that that ballot complexity is a bigger issue and more generally leads to such discrepancies. So that's why it's important that the committee look into ballot design and complexity, which is important to address whether or not Brookline chooses to adopt ranked choice voting. As for enfranchising, in a study from San Francisco, women running in RCV elections were more likely to win elections, and minority women were more likely to win elections. RCV increases diversity in elected candidates, as seen in representation by race in Minnesota, as we already heard, and in the study of women across the country. So where it's been studied, RCV may encourage new people to run and may increase chances of them winning. Another myth is that if it's so good, how come other people aren't using it? The truth is that because of the computation needed and the time needed to run the results, it hasn't been an option until more recently, but now there are numerous locales using it. Interest is very high, as has been noted at some of our neighbors here in Massachusetts, but also other cities, the state of Alaska, Maine, some whole countries like Australia and India, and I have a full list in your inbox as well with all the citations. So in conclusion, most of the concerns raised are not borne out by the evidence, which shows that it's doable, affordable, and does not disenfranchise voters. In short, please vote no on the advisory motion. I've done a lot of research, but we really need to fully do our homework first before we bring anything for a full vote. We want to work on this, hear from everyone, puzzle through all of these important details because elections matter and getting them right is so important. And then when we're done, we'll have a specific proposal. We'll understand how it could look in Brookline, how much it would cost, address all of these problems that are being raised, and maybe even suggest other changes to voting that we might propose. Elections are important. We want to get it right. And regardless, please vote yes on the petitioner's motion to study this. Thank you.
Ms. Frawley.
Regina Frawley, Precinct 16. A couple of my questions have been answered, and I appreciate that. Thank you. I was very interested in the cost of the machines, and that has been estimated at $130,000. But there was an implication that I find contradicts what we've been told, which is that, well, the parts aren't available and the machines are old. We just heard from the town clerk's office after the election how incredibly well all the machines worked. So there's no urgency about replacing it, and I don't think that's a legitimate thing to raise. What would be legitimate is what are the costs of the other machines? Have the petitioners considered spoiler possibilities with ranked choice? In regular elections, and there was one recently, I forget where this person with the same last name, a couple of people ran in order to split the vote. That happens a lot in politics. We've seen it in Massachusetts. I haven't seen it that I can recall in Brookline, but I have seen it in Massachusetts. What are the possibilities for spoilers in ranked choice? I also am concerned when Scott Ananian referred to ranked choice as being honest. The implication was the regular voting process wasn't, and I hope that's not what he wished to imply. And finally, having absolutely nothing to do with this, Barbara Scotto doesn't look like Scott Gladstone. There are now 2 Scott Gladstones identified on the screen, and I hope that won't nullify her vote when she goes to vote, or have Scott Gladstone be credited with 2 votes. That would be spoiling Scott. So thank you. Those are questions I've asked. Thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Frawley, we have that under control. Yes. Mr. Banka. You need to unmute yourself. Well, Mr. Banka, we're going to have to move on and see if you can figure out your problem. Mr. Schwartz?
This is Dick Benka.
Go ahead.
I am not on this article, Mr. Moderator.
I'm sorry. Okay, fine. Thank you for your point of order. Mr. Schwartz? SHP. You have to unmute yourself, Mr. Schwartz. Go ahead and talk. Speak. I'm afraid your mic isn't working. Mr. Schwartz? S-W-A-R-T-Z, Chuck. Yes.
Yes, hi, Mr. Moderator. Thank you. Chuck Schwartz, Precinct 9. I have a question, I believe for Nicole. She would be best to answer this. I like the idea of ranked choice voting very much. I do have to say that I lived in Cambridge for 15 years and never did understand how the voting system worked. I want to thank Harry for explaining that to me. My question is, I understand that if a person does not get a majority of the vote, then the person who got the least number of votes is eliminated, and those votes for that person would then be redistributed. My question is, if I was somebody who voted for the second to the last person, what would happen to my vote? Why wouldn't my vote matter? And would this leave me somewhat disenfranchised if the person who voted for the person who finished last had their votes counted and mine were not?
Ms. McLellan?
Hi, Nicole Mcclellan. I mean, it depends on whether that first round of elimination yielded a proportionate majority winner. If it did, your vote would still have counted towards the losing candidate, just as it would in a plurality voting. If it still didn't yield a proportionate majority winner, then you would go to the second lowest vote getter and they would be eliminated, but those votes would be reallocated to those voters' second choice, if that makes sense. So it's really a way, you're much less likely than in a plurality voting situation to have your vote immediately eliminated if you pick the loser. It's also worth noting, since Cambridge is being mentioned multiple times, that is in one of the whereas clauses, because it's good to know what our neighbors are doing. It doesn't mean that if we were to implement ranked choice voting, we would have to model it after Cambridge's sort of old and often unwieldy system. There are dozens and dozens of municipalities that do this in a much cleaner way, using software, and don't sort of have a relic of a system. So it's really not relevant to whether or not we should study ranked choice voting for Brookline, the fact that Cambridge does it in a weird way. There are multiple ways.
Mr. Toefl? Question has been called. We'll hear from Mr. Toefl, who I've.
Thank you. Yeah, Mike Toefl, Precinct 8. We're debating this as if we are right now deciding whether or not to engage in ranked choice voting, which is just silly. The whole point of this article is to do a study so that we can be informed to have this very discussion. So I'm delighted someone called the question, because I think we really ought to be just discussing, do we think it's worthy of study? And I want to encourage us to vote in favor of the petitioner's motion. The AC motion is very similar. It adds a few words that says whether or not, but ultimately we are going to weigh in on whether or not. So I think we should just go with the petitioner's motion, and I'm delighted to second the call the question.
doesn't need a second. I have Mr. Gaishak, Mr. Bassett, Ms. Giora Gorfain, Mr. Rosenthal, Ms. Greenwald, and Ms. Roberts. Ms. Frawley?
Yes, I think it's offensive that Mike thinks that it's silly to ask these questions at this point, rather than to wait for the study. I think that enough of us have attended enough meetings on enough topics in this town that it's worthy to ask in advance enough information to make our vote more informed as to whether we want to ask people to participate at yet another study committee. So that is an offense and you should apologize, Mike.
Well, I'm not going to ask for an apology. You've made your point, Ms. Frawley. On to the motion for the question, which requires a 2/3 vote. I've told you who's lined up to speak, and I have no idea what their positions are, but there they are, all 6 of them. And we're ready for a vote. Okay, the voting period is commenced. Yes, if you're in favor of terminating debate. No, if you're opposed, and abstain if you're abstaining. Voting period is terminated. Mr. Jones?
No.
Mr. Jones would have us continue to debate this. Ms. McNally?
No for McNally.
Mr. Dewart, Mac Dewart? Mr. Dewart? Okay, what is the count?
Okay, we've got 193 yes, 27 no, 9 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 193 in favor, 29 opposed, and 9 abstentions. So we now deal with the advisory committee substitute motion. If this motion passes, it becomes the main motion, and we do not reach the petitioner's motion. If it fails, we then vote on the petitioner's motion. If it does pass, we'll vote on it again as the main motion. So this is on the advisory committee motion on the yellow supplement number 1. You've heard the differences explained between that and the petitioner motion. Yes. Okay, the voting period is commenced. Yes, if you favor the advisory committee substitute motion. No, if you're opposed to it. Voting period, Mr. Jones?
No.
No. Ms. McNally?
McNally, yes.
And Mr. Dewart? Mr. Dewart hasn't figured it out yet. What's the count, please?
86 yes, 139 no, 4 abstentions.
Motion fails by a vote of 89 in favor, 140 opposed, and 4 abstentions. On the main motion, on page 1 of supplement number 2, the revised petitioner motion. All right, the voting period has started. Period has elapsed. Mr. Jones?
Yes. Yes.
Ms. McNally?
McNally, yes.
Mr. Dewart? What's the count?
We have 184 yes, 34 no, 10 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 186 in favor, 34 opposed, and 10 abstentions. We turn to Articles 19 and 20, which we're going to debate together, that have to do with the manner in which the town clerk is either elected or appointed. The motions under both these articles are on page 19-6. The motion on page 19-6, moved by Mr. Van Scoyoc, seconded by Mr. Friedman, that the town's elected town clerk become an appointed town clerk, etc. The motion under Article 20 is also on page 19-6, moved by Mr. Van Scoyoc and seconded by Mr. Friedman, an amplification of the manner in which the general bylaws will be amended to provide for an appointed town clerk. I call on Mr. Van Scoyoc.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. John Van Scoyoc, Select Board. Also a town meeting member for some 30 years. And I mentioned that because I would so love to be back at the high school facing the moderator at his podium on the stage with Pat Ward to the moderator's left, doing what he did for many years and doing it well as he always did, which is to keep the records of this town meeting. And Pat Ward is very much in my mind tonight and in my heart. Pat is our elected town clerk, and I think we all know he's been out of commission since the beginning of this year because of illness. It's been a very difficult time for him. He has spent a long time in recovery. It's going to be a long time yet as he continues to recover. And it just so happens that when I got elected to the select board, one of the things that I knew from some experience with the process of the election, but also some years of experience in dealing with town hall, is that it was time for Brookline to do with the town clerk's position what it had done with the town treasurer's position many years before, which is to recognize that the duties and the obligations that fall on the town clerk are such that we really needed to rely on people who were recruited vetted, and who represented the best of the professional quality individuals who could be drawn on and appointed to the town clerk's position. That's what my head told me. What my heart told me was Pat was still on his back. Pat was still in the hospital. What would Pat think if I went forward with this article? And I've worried about it ever since. And I'm telling you that quite honestly. It preyed on my mind. And it came as such a relief to me that within the past week that Pat wrote to all of us. And I'm going to take the liberty of reading what he wrote. Dear town meeting members, I'm writing to you to ask you to vote favorable action on Articles 19 and 20. Article 19 transitions the town clerk from an elected to an appointed position. Favorable action on this article will simply place this important change before the voters of the town in the form of a question on next May's town election ballot. Favorable action on Article 20 will codify this change into the town's general bylaws. During the past 3 decades, a sea change has occurred in the costs, technology, security, and administration of elections, especially in the age of this pandemic. Major changes have also occurred in public records access and vital records management. Of the communities in Massachusetts over 50,000 population, only Brookline elects its clerk. The town clerk's position has evolved into an important administrative officer in every community. An elected clerk is the last vestige of colonial governance when clerks were elected at the beginning of each town meeting. No longer just a scrivener, the clerk has emerged with a multifaceted office subject to a myriad of laws and regulations. In its wisdom, the town of Brookline over the past 100 years has voted to change a number of boards and commissions, as well as administrative officers from elected to appointed positions. The last one being the town treasurer. I believe it is now time to do the same for the town clerk. And Pat continues. The town of Brookline has been very fortunate in that its past 6 clerks were all trained as assistant town clerks prior to them assuming their position. Each brought years of experience to the office. A direct result of this good fortune was the lack of urgency concerning succession planning. However, as the office faces increasing challenges for the future, it makes sense to have the town administrator recruit, vet, and make a recommendation to the select board for appointment rather than face the vagaries of the ballot box. It is imperative that future town clerks remain apolitical, experienced, and professional. Article 19, if approved by a town meeting and the voters, will ensure exactly that. Please vote yes on Article 19. Sincerely, Patrick Ward, Town Clerk. I will also add, and I don't wish to go on too long, I overrun my time.
30 seconds.
I would be remiss if I did not mention Linda Goldberg, the assistant town clerk, who also wrote a letter. I will not read it, but I will just assure you that her letter fully endorsed Pat's view of the office and the need for Brookline to move on. The time has come for Brookline to do what many other communities in our position have done. Take advantage of the talent pool that exists, and it is a terrific talent pool that you will be impressed by the quality of people who will come forward with experience, certifications, proven abilities, and we need them. We need a future town clerk who is drawn from the best. And I'm relieved that Pat Ward has also seen fit to stand behind that very urgent appeal to the town meeting. And I hope the town meeting members will agree with Pat in their vote tonight. Thank you.
Mr. Vitolo?
Tommy Vitolo, State Representative and Town Meeting Member at Large. I believe in the power of the voter. I have since I cast my first vote in Raleigh, North Carolina at 18 years old. My belief in the power of the voter is affirmed every single election, including November 2008, November 2016, and November 2020. Our American ideal, one that we must continue to strive for, is that our government works for all people. The most fundamental mechanism to achieve this is to establish and ensure the power of the voter. Now, this does not mean that we ought to vote for every civil servant or even every policymaker. But since elections are the very mechanism to ensure the power of the voter, I believe it imperative that the government official charged with protecting, maintaining, and operating our elections answer directly to the voter. I believe that it would be a tremendous mistake to transfer complete authority over the person charged with ensuring the fairness of our elections from the voter to the most powerful elected officials in our town. So why not just let the voters vote on this too? Power of the voter, right? That's a cop-out. We are a representative democracy. It is our job as town meeting members, the representatives closest to the townspeople, to protect our democracy. I believe that we should vote no action on 19 and 20. The power of the voter. Voters decide the composition of town meeting. Voters choose town meeting members with one expertise or another, or town meeting members with no expertise at all. Voters have put their trust in us, and each of us use our own judgment in determining how best to serve. And indeed, if we decide we'd like to serve another term, the voters, and only the voters, must approve. If they approve, we continue to serve. Even if we haven't read the combined reports, taken a 1-hour training class, or even bothered to attend town meeting at all. I believe that we should reject Warrant Article 28's requirements on town meeting members. It is for the voters to select on current or promised expertise in one area or another, not for anyone else. In the same vein, I support both the Spiegel and Bassett amendments to Warrant Article 29. Simply put, the advisory committee advises us, the town meeting, on all warrant matters. Shouldn't voters from all 16 precincts have directly elected representation in that advice on decisions affecting all 16 precincts? Shouldn't emergency expenditures include an elected voice from every precinct? And shouldn't elected members make up the bulk of the voices on that sage dedicated body? I believe so. I urge you to protect the power of the voter. Protect the power of the voter by voting no on Warrant Articles 19 and 20. Protect the power of the voter by voting no on Warrant Article 28's requirements on town meeting members. And protect the power of the voter by voting yes on Warrant Article 29's Spiegel and Bassett amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bors. Yep. Harry.
Good evening. Harry Bors speaking on behalf of the Committee of Town Organizations and Structures. Brookline has not had a contested race for town clerk in over 30 years, and we'll never know exactly why. What we do know now, though, is that our current town clerk, whom we've been very lucky to have for so long, will not be standing for re-election this spring. And historically, when the town clerk has stepped down, the acting assistant town clerk has stood for election and taken up the responsibility, bringing somebody who is both trained and experienced. However, this time around, that will not be the case, as our current assistant town clerk has made known to us that she will not be running for the position. Hers is a well-deserved retirement that is long overdue. So not to emphasize the point, but this does add a certain element of urgency to our decision. But beyond this urgency with regards to transition is the larger issue of the long view. So let's be clear, the job of town clerk is not an entry-level position. It's a professional position, even if it is currently filled through public acclamation. It is complex, and it requires professional expertise and skills and the expectation of being a certified municipal clerk. The position should be a senior hands-on appointed professional that is integrated into the town's governing and administrative structure, as we do with our other department heads. Now, there will undoubtedly be an element of nostalgia attached to this, or a sense that there's a poetic alignment in having our election official tethered directly to the electorate. It's more likely, though, that the voters every 3 years evaluate the performance of the town clerk based on how long they stand in line at the polls, or whether their mail-in ballot had them assigned to the proper party, generally not realizing the full depth and breadth of the responsibilities of this office, much less make an annual appraisal of the department's performance, needs, and goals, again, as we do with other departments. But being a town clerk is not just about running the elections or issuing licenses. The town clerk is our town archivist, managing the registry of vital statistics, maintaining town documents and databases. The town clerk is the official keeper of the seal, certifying planning and zoning decisions, tax rates, notes for borrowing. This is why the position and office need to be integrated into the workings of the town as a whole, not merely as a standalone agency. Now, concern has been voiced that an appointed clerk could be under the thumb of the town administrator or the select board, who may exert pressure to subvert the election process in some way. But let's not kid ourselves. Brookline Town Hall is not Tammany Hall. And there have been stories of elected clerks in other municipalities hiring cronies and installing registrars who enroll the right sorts of voters. So this is to say that conspiracy theories can cut both ways. And one need only look at the town of Franklin this past fall to see the potential pitfalls of electing somebody who may not be quite up to the task. CTOS heard from both Jeff Nutting and Linda Goldberg. Between the two of them, they have a wealth of experience and insight, broadly and specifically to Brookline. And both have been very clear that the Brookline town clerk should be an appointed position. As you've heard, Pat Ward and Linda Goldberg recently sent us eloquent, concise, insightful comments on these articles and the town clerk position. It is their opinion that it is time for us to change the way in which the position is filled. They've seen the changes in the office, its requirements, and its responsibilities, and they want to see this office move forward on structurally sound footing, and that means making this an appointment. We believe that these articles are the best way to ensure we have the best candidates from the broadest selection pool and to better structure us as an organization for transition. The articles allow for an appointed town clerk who's not necessarily required to be a town resident. The appointment is going to be by the select board, as it is with other department heads. And in reviewing this legislation and consulting with town council, we are confident that an appointment does not require town residency, as it does for elected officials. But the language of the article will underscore that understanding. If passed here tonight, this question will appear on the general ballot in the spring. CTOS is recommending the passage of these two articles because we believe it's time and that now is the right time. Thank you.
Thank you. Rebecca Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Rebecca Stone, Precinct 3, and Chair of the Commission for Women, but speaking just for myself on this, the Commission for Women did not consider this article. I am sympathetic to the arguments for Article 19 and 20, especially after hearing from Pat Ward, Linda Goldberg, and Jeff Nutting about the complexity of the job's public record keeping, storage, and archiving responsibilities. If that were the whole job, I'd probably be voting in favor too, but it's not. Our town clerk is also our chief elections officer, and I'm speaking against making this change because, like Tommy, I believe accountability for the administration of elections needs to be to the voters, not to the select board or the town administrator. Indeed, some of the municipalities that have shifted to an appointed clerk position have separated out the role of administering elections from the clerk's office. That will not be the case here. Harry Boers argued that in Brookline, we can trust that the town administrator and select board will hire someone of integrity and competence. But it is November 2020, and this month has been a masterclass on how critical it is to remove the political pressure of executive appointment from those responsible for the integrity of our elections. I want the town clerk to worry about every voter's vote, not just the 5 votes on the select board. We've also heard that candidates who haven't been assistant town clerk will not have the knowledge, experience, or training to do the job, especially if we are just drawing from Brookline residents. But we talk all the time about the wealth of knowledge and experience in Brookline, and this position has a substantial salary with full benefits. So there's no reason to think that it won't attract qualified candidates. Yes, they might have to learn on the job, but we've experienced staff in the office, and we elect plenty of people in this town, in this state, and in this country to positions of great complexity who have not been apprenticing for the position. Voters must consider what the candidates bring in terms of professional readiness and personal appeal, both of which are important for this very public-facing position. My second concern is that I believe we are making a mistake in taking a piecemeal approach to what are fundamental structural issues of how we are governed. Many of us agree that Brookline has grown too large and complex, that we are struggling under our all-volunteer government and cumbersome town structure. Whether it's the size of the town clerk's job, the need for greater nimbleness in responding to challenges, little diversity in both elected and appointed offices, or a lack of long-term vision in zoning decisions, to name just a few we're discussing this fall. Addressing each of these large issues in isolation, however, may well give rise to other issues without solving our larger problem. We need instead to think comprehensively about how our governance structure can be more responsive to our current and future needs. To do that, I believe we should be putting together a charter commission, but that's a subject for another day. For now, I urge you to leave our chief elections officer accountable to the voters and vote no action on Article 19.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Harry Friedman, Precinct 12, speaking on behalf of the Advisory Committee. The Advisory Committee recommends favorable action on the motions offered under warrant Articles 19 and 20. I personally don't like change. I still have rotary telephones here in my home. In my world, the electric company is still the Edison, and the organization that runs public transportation in Boston is still the MTA. If you open your combined reports and turn to the list of advisory committee members on the second page, you will find my telephone number listed as BE20122. Pause while everyone opens their combined reports. Oh, sorry. This stands for Beacon 2, one of the old Brookline exchanges used by the phone company, although New England TNT stopped using the letter exchanges a few years ago. I think it was 1964. In any event, because I do not like change, my initial reaction to the idea of an appointed town clerk was negative. In Massachusetts, the town clerk was one of the earliest offices established in colonial towns. The settlers knew the importance of keeping accurate written records of their agreements and actions, including grants of land, regulations governing animals, the collection of taxes, the recording of births, deaths, and marriages, as well as the expenditure of town funds. The person given the responsibility for recording these things was often also given other duties, such as sweeping the meeting house and selling the seats, ringing the bell, and paying the bounty for jays and blackbirds, whose heads were presented to him by the citizens. Who knew? As both Pat and Linda have stated, the duties of the clerk have changed over the years. Today, running the office requires the skills of a 21st century manager. Running an election has become a sophisticated business. The skill set for such a person no longer necessarily resides within the town of Brookline. We need to be able to seek managers from outside the town. We need to tap people who may not be interested in running and funding a public campaign for office. While I do not like change, things have changed. Brookline stopped electing its treasurer in 1992. The
1
time
minute.
for a similar change in the clerk's office has arrived. We've been lucky that in the recent past, we have had competent people able and willing to run for this office. Our luck may not hold. Please join the advisory committee, our current clerk and assistant town clerk in supporting the motions offered under warrant articles 19 and 20. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Gary.
Mr. Moderator, Gary Jones, Precinct 3. And my concern is there is a belief, it seems, that I got to
Gary, mute your
unmute,
television.
excuse me, Mr. Moderator. I got to take my television off because
Thank
I'm
you.
hearing an echo. But I feel very strongly that town clerk should be an elected official. And all we have to do in 2020 is what would have happened in the state of Georgia if the official in Georgia had been an appointed official. I think we know what would have happened. They weren't interested in doing the right thing. And it goes beyond a technical job. The whole thing is the possibility to be a town clerk in a town like Brookline is to encourage involvement. I mean, it could be an outreach to people to get more voters. It could be, a voting advocate, a voting rights advocate. I mean, the town meeting, we've got to realize that this isn't something that is just a technical job that's going to be run by a bureaucrat, by the way, who's not going to step on toes. He's certainly not going to, he or she is not going to be an advocate for voters. It's not going to be an advocate for outreach. It's not going to be as strong as a person that's elected by the people. Speaking for myself, as an elected town librarian, town library trustee, I was elected by the people, and I could advocate to keep a library in Brookline open in the summer. Now, whether my other trustees went along with me or the librarian, I could still speak up for those people that wanted their library open in the summer. And my feeling about this whole thing is that when you have a non-elected town clerk, you're limiting the limits of how that clerk could be an advocate and a community organizer. Now, those things aren't listed as a qualification, but for those reasons, I ask you to vote no action on Article 19 and 20. Thank you.
Mr. Ananian.
Thank you, Scott Ananian, town meeting member, Precinct 10. So I am disappointed in how this matter was handled. Since early spring, a vacancy has existed. Under the existing select board powers, MGL Chapter 41, Section 14, the select board has had the power to search for and appoint a clerk under the temporary clerk provisions in state law since early this year. The fact that we've been more than ably served by the assistant town clerk, Linda Goldberg, and Jeff Nutting as a contractor does not excuse the lack of succession planning for this very important office. Nor, having survived this year's election season, is there any reason not to begin or have begun already the search process for a temporary town clerk. Instead, the position of clerk, a very important position, as many before me have said, was left vacant all year and continuing through this coming May. So I'll repeat that, no clerk for our coming town election in May, which appears to be set to have a number of competitive races, including perhaps for clerk. Further, the articles being presented are incomplete. As Mr. Benke has noted on the TMA list, several changes to the Town Administrator Act are required, which requires a home rule position to amend. We are being asked to vote on the change to appointed clerk with only half the pieces complete and no idea who or what sort of clerk the select board may recruit or appoint. Instead, the select board could have begun immediately early this year a broad and diverse job search, including contacting bright and eager assistant town clerks from other towns, negotiated with the select candidate and Linda the best transition timing, providing the new candidate several months to establish residency in town before May. They could have written the necessary changes to the Town Administrator Act and put them on this warrant. Then we could be having an informed debate with full knowledge of the candidate that would be appointed and full knowledge of the changes necessary to the Town Administrator Act. The already appointed candidate would be already working for us, for the town, and they would have all the benefits of incumbency in the upcoming May election. I am in favor of removing the residency requirements in order to cast our net wider for the best clerk possible. I am not in favor of the process that led to these articles. So again, I respect Linda and Jeff's work this year immensely in an enormously difficult year. And if the clerk recruitment had been done in a timely manner, there is a way I could be supporting these articles today. If the town meeting approves these articles, the election will be complicated and the voters will not know who one of the candidates is. The mystery candidate who the select board would appoint. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I expect the town to introduce the missing home rule petition that ought to have been presented with these articles at the annual town meeting in the spring. I will likely introduce a home rule petition to remove the residency requirement for our elected clerk in the event that the town meeting or the town do not approve the changes being proposed here tonight. This has been a tough year, all the more reason we should have acted quickly and responsibly here instead of leaving the town without a clerk for so long. If this warrant article passes, I urge the select board to use their already existing powers to swiftly begin the search and appointment process for a temporary appointed town clerk so that we will have the necessary assistance in the clerk's office in the first half of 2021, and so that the voters in May will know what their choices are when they cast their ballots, whether for one of the elected candidates or alternatively for a known appointed clerk. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Goldsmith? You may have to unmute yourself, Ms. Goldsmith.
Yeah, thank you. I've now been unmuted by the moderator. Jennifer Goldsmith, town meeting member, Precinct 11. I hope everyone is well and safe tonight. And I'm speaking in support of these warrant articles. And I want to say first, I agree with Representative Vitolo. The power of the vote is critical. It's critical for our democracy, but it is not critical for all jobs. And some of the data I'm going to show you tonight, hopefully you have, Ben, do you guys have my slides to pull up by any chance? Is going to show you really that although we want to view this as a democratically elected position, the data don't really bear out that that's how it's played out. So I want to talk about this first in terms of appointment. And I'd really like to frame the language as what we're talking about is recruiting, interviewing, and hiring the most qualified candidates, regardless of the zip code where they live. And I worked with the clerk closely to gather data for our survey a year and a half ago and on some other projects. And I can say that this is a data-driven skill set, which isn't one that we as voters are necessarily attuned to. As the clerk explained in his letter, this position is a holdout. He's comparing the role he's in now with the technical leaders of departments and the way this position is filled all the way across the Commonwealth. By having this holdout position as an elected position, we are losing out on specialized skills and experience. We're losing out on having annual performance reviews, setting goals annually, benchmarking versus peers, and being attuned to the best practices for this role. And with all due respect to town meeting member Stone, it is important to have experience to know how to do a job. Just having a good spirit about it isn't enough. And for those who perceive our elections as sufficient as a referendum on performance, can you go to the next slide, please? This is a picture of our elections from 2000 to 2018. The line across the bottom shows you the voter turnout for our May elections. The highest was 35%. I believe there was an override in that year, and the lowest was 10% as far as turnout. The bars show you the votes cast for the incumbent versus not cast at all. So what you see on average is that we had a 20% voter turnout, and on average, 31% of the voters left blank the vote for the town clerk. So if we're saying this is the power of the vote, and if people really care, they're going to vote for this, that's not what we're seeing in the data. And if you've ever had a job where your boss ignored doing a performance review year after year, it wouldn't be seen as endorsement of your performance. It would be a dereliction of his or her duty. But the question of May elections is really a question of, is this the right way to appoint or elect someone with a technical skill set? Regarding the question, and I'd love to go to the next slide just quickly to show you these, the top part shows you the years in which we elected the town clerk. The boxes show you those particular years. There's no correlation between a high turnout as an endorsement of his performance and the years that we voted on that position at all. The lower part of the slide shows you turnout from May versus November for a series of years, and the consistently low rate of our May turnouts is a whole other problem, but it certainly doesn't say to me that it's a referendum on a great performance or the right way to evaluate this job. But more importantly, we talk about this idea of hiring from within Brookline or electing from within Brookline. We know the many ways this town is exclusionary, and limiting this position to our 3 zip codes perpetuates that exclusion. $100,000 job or $110,000 job is a lot in the grand scheme of things, but it's actually not enough to live in Brookline. And to presume that the pipeline of people who would be candidates for this job, assistant clerks in other towns, would somehow relocate here before May or be able to afford to live here is just, it's just sort of silly.
1 minute.
Thank you. I think that hiring a clerk, or if you want to call it appointing, but I'd say hiring, is far more likely to diversify our workforce if we do it outside of our zip codes. If we're aiming to hire from within for town roles, I suggest developing apprenticeship models in all our departments, but that's a different question. And if so, I know that there are people who think that appointing or hiring a town clerk is some kind of coup on the part of the select board. And there are other people who think that the power of the vote in democracy is the way to hire the best candidate for this position. I think it's interesting that 2 typically very different constituencies may coalesce to vote against this warrant article or this set of warrant articles. But in fact, I think they would be thoroughly misserving this town. I hope you'll vote with Pat Ward's own observation and Linda Goldberg's observation and the data right in front of you that show you that a vote is not a referendum on anything but a very small number of people in town showing up in May. And thank you for your time. Please vote for these warrant articles.
Thank you, Ms. McLellan.
Hi, Nicole Mcclellan, town meeting member, precinct 11. I appreciate what others have said. I admit at first I was conflicted about this, but very simply what I kept coming back to is when you are proposing taking a vote away from 30,000 people, the burden of proof should be on the person or people proposing that change to demonstrate that the benefits of that change clearly outweigh the very clear drawback, which is, in this case, a disempowering of the voting populace of Brookline. I do not believe that the select board with this warrant article has met that burden of proof. To be clear, I have great respect for Pat Ward and his many years of service to our town. My comments are not a reflection on any single person, but on the general issues that seem to have emerged. What has become apparent is that there was precious little contingency planning in place as a safeguard against the unexpected absence of a critical town official. And that necessarily has brought up an important conversation and identified areas for improvement, and it's good that we're having that conversation. However, my concern is that this warrant article seems primarily to be almost a reactionary response to these realizations, as opposed to a full and thoughtful plan for avoiding a repeat outcome of this sort in the future. It's very important to note that a lack of contingency planning can happen just as well under an appointed person as it can under an elected one. I have seen it. If we do this, it should be because we believe that the select board is better able to review an applicant pool and all candidates and choose who's best equipped to manage our elections. That in essence, the select board knows better than the general voting public. With some decisions, I'm sure that they do, but in others, they do not. And at this point, I'm not sure which is the case regarding this town clerk issue. It's a very big deal to potentially put in motion a change that consolidates power away from voters and into the executive. It should require a very high burden of proof, and that has not, in my opinion, been met in this case. So without that confidence, I'm not comfortable saying to my constituents that I voted for something that might take their vote away. I will be voting no on these warrant articles, and I hope you'll consider doing the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Daly. Nancy.
Hi, Nancy Daly, Precinct 12. Historically, in the Commonwealth, this type of job was seen as something, if you had a lot of friends or relatives in town, a kind of easy place to have a guaranteed income and maybe not have to work too hard. I thought, were got incredibly lucky with Pat Ward. Pat actually did have a lot of friends and relatives in town, but he also had experience in the town clerk's office, and he was in law school and working nights and weekends on his law degree. In the early days, he was in this office. And so as the technology and the rules surrounding voting have gotten more complex, Pat was right on top of them. 4 or 5 years ago, when I was on the Board of Selectmen, he and I had a conversation about this, and I said then, you know, you should kind of give us the heads up before you're going to retire, because I think that this has gotten more complex, and we want to make sure we would have someone in that job who had all the requisite skills, and so we should change it to an appointed position, and he agreed with me at that time. Unfortunately, due to his illness, his decision was kind of precipitated. But I think this does need to be an appointed position to make sure we have someone who has all the competencies that are needed, and to have someone that's not overly tied to one political party or another. So I'm going to vote in favor of these articles, and I hope you will too. Thank you.
Mr. Gordon?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Neil Gordon, Town Meeting Member for Precinct 1 and a member of the Advisory Committee. As Pat Ward noted in his letter to town meeting members, the town clerk's position has evolved, as he described it, from electing a scribe to take minutes to managing a complex office. The current role is highly regulated and highly technical. On the other hand, there are important policy aspects to the town clerk's job. Among those that are important, I'll mention one very narrow slice: selection of polling places for election day as well as for early voting. Who can walk to the polls? Who needs to drive? What about the seniors? Are polling places accessible and ADA compliant? These are conversations I've had with Pat Ward casually as I happened to be in his office for one reason or another, and polling places became unavailable. I'm wary of limiting a pool of town clerk candidates to those who are Brookline voters, but I'm also wary of appointing a town clerk who may lack local knowledge, empathy, and a sense of democratic duty that goes beyond efficiency and fiscal concerns of running an office. Should we and the voters choose an appointed and not an elected town clerk, town meeting surely will have some work to do establishing guidelines. I support a vote of favorable action and letting the voters decide.
Well, we've been debating this matter for 45 minutes, and I think we've heard an adequate representation of the arguments on both sides. I have a motion for the question before us, and the following people lined up to speak or ask questions: Mr. Kaufman, Mr. Rosenthal, Ms. Frawley, Mr. Weintraub, Ms. Khan, Ms. Hillman, Ms. Zimmerman, and Mr. Karen. The motion's been motioned for the question, and will requires a 2/3 vote whenever you're ready. The voting period has commenced. Yes, if you wish to close off debate at this point. No, if you wish to continue. And abstain if you're abstaining. Voting period is terminated. Jones. Is the motion to terminate debate, Mr. Jones?
No.
No. Ms. McNally?
McNally, no.
Mr. Dewart?
Dewart, yes.
Count, please.
We have 163 yes, 58 no, 8 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 164 in favor, 59 opposed, and 8 abstentions. So we proceed to a vote on the motion under Article 19, which is on page 19-6, to have the clerk become appointed. Yes. Voting period has started. Yes, if you're in favor of the motion on page 19-6, the first motion under Article 19. No, if you're opposed. Jones?
No.
Ms. McNally?
McNally, no.
And Mr. Dewart?
Dewart, no.
Dewart, no. Dewart, yes. I'm sorry. Okay. The count, please.
146 yes, 77 no, 4 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 146 in favor, 80 opposed, and 4 abstentions. We turn to the motion under Article 20, which is at the bottom of page 19-6, a amendment of the bylaws to reflect what we just voted in Article 19. The voting period has commenced. Yes, if you're in favor of the motion under Article 20. No, if you're opposed, and abstain if you're abstaining. Voting period. Mr. Jones?
No.
Ms. McNally?
McNally, yes.
And Mr. Dewart? Okay, may I have the count, please?
Yes.
Yes, Dewart? Thank you.
Okay, we got 158 yes, 59 no, 9 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 160 in favor, 60 opposed, and 9 abstentions. Ms. Bernard?
Yes, hi, Lauren Bernard, Precinct 8. Just in texting with various people, a number of us are very confused as to what the difference was between 19 and 20. Could you explain a little better? I mean, it is one just to, is not 20 simply to codify 19?
Sorry, just a moment, please. 19 is a vote to have the town's elected town clerk become an appointed town clerk. With the follow, and it calls for a question to be placed in the ballot in May of 2021 for the voters at large to vote on the question set forth as part of that motion. The motion under Article 20 was an amendment of the bylaws to provide that the town clerk shall be appointed and that shall not be required to be a resident, is basically what that. So the first is a general motion calling for an election, and the second is an amendment of the bylaws to reflect an appointed clerk. I hope that's clear enough. We turn now to Articles 24 and 25, which we will debate together. Article 24 is found on the main motion is on pages 24-1 to 3. It's in the words of the article. And there's an amendment offered by the advisory committee. And I think the easiest thing for me to do is to track through pages 24-1 through 3 to show you how to convert the article to a motion that you'll be voting on and where the advisory committee amendment fits in. So in the first place, the first line that says to see if the town will amend the general bylaws relating to notices mailed to businesses, etc. That should be changed to read voted that the town amend. So strike the words to see and will. This motion, by the way, is made by Ms. Lindenboim and seconded by Ms. McLellan. And if you turn to page 24-3, the advisory committee would have us insert at the beginning of section 8.4, in the middle of section page 24-3, the following language. To the extent practicable, using the town's available data, the following apply, then A, B, C, D. And in A, finally, the second line of subparagraph A under section 8.4, please insert the word owners, comma, after the word provided to. So the second line will read manner or timing of information provided to owners, comma, residents and tenants. The motion under Article 25 is similarly in the words of the article and needs the same amendment. So I'll run through those. Moved by Ms. Lindenboim, seconded by Ms. McLellan. First, you will amend the first line of the motion to read voted that the town amend the Brookline zoning bylaw. And what this motion does is the same thing as Article 24, except it relates to changes to the zoning bylaw. The advisory committee would have us insert at the bottom of page 25-2, after the title, section 9.13, the same words, to the extent practicable, using the town's available data, the following apply, colon. And then in that paragraph A, the same change in the second line, inserting the word owner, owners, comma, before the word residents and tenants. And the advisory committee's motions to amend are made by Mr. Doughty and seconded by Ms. Heller. I call on Ms. Lindenboim. Lindenboim.
Okay. Good evening, Mr. Moderator, town meeting members. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Fine.
Warrant Articles 24 and 25 amend the town's general and zoning bylaws to finally, in 2020, acknowledge that renters are residents too. If approved by town meeting, the effect of the warrant articles would be to clarify and codify the provision of information and notice to all residents and business owners who would be similarly impacted by a planned or proposed action, not just property owners. Now, while approximately half of all Brookline residents rent rather than own their home, if you look at our bylaws, they seem to reflect an earlier time. We no longer consider property ownership to be a prerequisite for voting or for holding office, yet our bylaws consider only the owners of land, regardless of whether they even reside on the property, to be worthy of consideration in and notification of many neighborhood activities and land use issues such as property demolition, noise control, and zoning variances. And this has real world implications. And I ask you to consider the following questions. First, should contractors hired by Public Works be required to inform renters at the same time that they notify property owners when planned routine maintenance will shut off their water and sewer for a day? Or what about informing someone who rents when the transportation board holds a public hearing to consider removing all on-street parking from their street? Or should a renter receive notice of a public hearing regarding a special permit their landlord has applied for, in one case, to lease space for a marijuana dispensary on the first floor of the building they live in? Now, all three of these situations happened recently in Brookline, and in all of those cases, the property owner was notified of the pending actions, and the renters who lived there were not. So warrant articles 24 and 25 would amend our bylaws to include renters in these kinds of notifications. Practically speaking, the implementation of these articles wouldn't be difficult. The town's website already has an abutters application where you can identify not just the abutters in a legal sense, but also the people that are actually living on the abutting property at the time, whether they're owners or renting or operating a business there. So using both of those bits of information, you can provide notice to anyone who's either owning, living, or operating a business on the abutting property. And as you will hear, the costs for this modest increase in notifications is relatively minor. I would also like to add that when we brought these articles before the advisory committee, the planning committee, and the select board, the most frequent reaction that we got was surprise. Surprised that Brookline wasn't already regularly treating renters and owners the same when it came to essentially letting people know about things proposed close to their home that could potentially have a significant impact on their daily lives.
1 minute.
So these warrant articles aim to fix a real problem, but I also hope they will activate us to consider the many unexamined ways in which inequity, classism, and racism are embedded in the structure and function of our community and local, state, and national government, and then work to remedy the situation, even when the remedy is not as easy and as clear as it is in these two warrant articles. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dennis Doughty, Town Meeting Member Precinct 3, speaking for Unanimous Advisory Committee. Warrant Articles 24 and 25 propose to amend the general bylaws and zoning bylaws respectively, such that whenever notices are required to be delivered to individuals or businesses based on location, such notices should now be additionally delivered to tenants and residents of the properties in question. This is a change that is good for Brookline. There have been compelling examples presented of projects, most notably, but not limited to, Sanctuary Medicinal in Hancock Village, where residents of the buildings in question were unaware of hearings that affected those properties because they received no notice. The advisory committee recognizes that improving the distribution of information to these additional interested parties is desirable. And in fact, the committee only had two questions of note. One, is it possible for the town to do this? And two, would it add significant extra costs? Taking the second question first, there is a modest cost associated with compliance. There are, after all, extra envelopes to be stuffed and extra postage to purchase. But these costs are minimal and the return on this investment would be high. As noted in the combined reports, complying with this requirement would have added $210 extra to the cost of the notices to be sent out for a hypothetical hearing regarding the Waldo Durgan site. And many of these increased costs can be directly passed through to permit applicants, and we recommend updating the town's permit fee structure to do so. As far as it being possible to comply, the planning department has already indicated its intention to do so. To account for the possibility that one or more of the databases to be used may on occasion be incomplete, the advisory committee's amendment adds language to clarify that the expectation is that the town will make its best efforts using available data to provide the required notices. The advisory committee unanimously recommends favorable action on both warrant article 24 and 25 as so amended.
Thank you, Ms. Heller.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Nancy Heller for a unanimous select board. We urge support of these articles as amended by the advisory committee, and it seems that they are in a category of no-brainers. Of course, tenants should be made aware of issues affecting them and their neighbors. Tenants are residents. They care about where they live and what happens. The costs are modest. Planning board says we can comply. The advisory committee has made a modest amendment which would ensure that in the event something happens and we don't quite have the data, we'll get better next time. So let's all please vote unanimously, as the select board and advisory committee both did, unanimously for both of these articles. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Neil Gordon, Precinct 1 Town Meeting, member of the Advisory Committee. Let me limit my remarks to a recommendation of favorable action on both articles as amended by the Advisory Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heiken. Speaking about on the Article 25, which deals with the zoning bylaws. Heikin. I think you can start talking, Mr. Heiken. We can hear you now, so speak up. Okay, well, I'm going to have to move along to Ms. Gilman. Jane Gilman.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Jane Gilman, Precinct 3. I think everyone will support this sensible measure. I just want to point out that it is a way of getting more involvement in our elections and getting more interest in the town. And I think it's a very good thing. And I just wanted to emphasize that point. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no more. Oh, Mr. Rudolph.
Hi, this is Jeff Rudolph, Precinct 6. I'm in favor of these articles, but I do have one question. Does anyone know how many notifications we sent out in either 2019 or so far in 2020, and how many additional notifications we would be sending out if we added renters? I understand that the costs are moderate, but I'd like to know exactly how much it will be.
Ms. Steinfeld, can you respond to that question?
Yes, to the extent that we did not run those numbers. I'm sorry, Allison Steinfeld, Planning Director. We did not run those numbers. We did run the numbers on the hypothetical Waldo Durgan in a very dense area of town, and it would have been around a couple of $100. Obviously, that's in other parts of town where it's less densely developed and more single-family homes, the cost would be minimal.
Thank you. I guess that's the best answer you're going to get. On The motion under Article 24, the main motion on page 24-1, I'm sorry, we'll deal first with the advisory committee amendment to insert at, in Article 24 motion, to insert after the title of section 8.4, the words "to the extent practicable, comma, using the town's available data, comma, the following apply, colon." This is advisory committee. Yes. Okay, the voting period has started. And we're going to have Article 25 AC amendment as well when we get there. This is on the advisory committee amendment. Yes if you're in favor, no if you're opposed, and abstain if you're abstaining. The voting, Mr.
Yes.
Ms. McNally,
McNally, yes.
and Mr. Dewart,
Stewart, yes.
as a count, please.
We have 216 yes, 2 no, 5 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 218 in favor, 2 opposed, and 5 abstentions. On the main motion under Article 24 as so amended, voting period has commenced. Yes, if you're in favor of the main motion on pages 24-1 to 24-3 as amended by the advisory committee. No if you're opposed. Voting period has elapsed. Jones,
Yes.
Ms. McNally,
McNally, yes.
Mr. Dewart,
Stewart, yes.
the count, please.
226 yes, 1 no, 2 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 229 in favor, 1 opposed, and 2 abstentions. On Article 25, requiring a 2/3 vote. First, on the advisory committee amendment, which is to insert the language in section 9.13, to the extent practicable using the town's available data, the following apply. This is the main motion requires a 2/3 vote. The amendment requires only a majority vote. Voting period has started. Voting period has elapsed. Jones,
Yes.
Ms. McNally,
McNally, yes.
Mr. Dewart,
Stewart, yes.
thank you. Count, please.
219 yes, 2 no, 5 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 222 in favor, 2 opposed, and 5 abstentions on the main motion under Article 25, pages 125-1 to 25-3, as amended by the Advisory Committee's motion. Voting period has commenced. This is the main motion on Article 25. Voting period has elapsed. Jones,
Jones, yes.
Ms. McNally,
McNally, yes.
Mr. Dewart,
Stewart, yes.
what's the count, please?
226 yes, 0 no, 1 abstention.
Motion carries unanimously, 229 votes in favor, no votes opposed, and 1 abstention. We bypass, well, there's no motion being offered under Article 26. We have voted at the beginning of the meeting to defer consideration of Article 27 until Thursday, December 3rd. And we have voted as well to defer consideration of Article 28 to Wednesday evening, December 2nd. So we turn to Article 29. The main motion on Article 29 is found on the yellow supplement number 3 at the bottom, over to page 4 of that supplement. So it's pages 1 through 4. It's moved by Mr. Wyszynski, seconded by Mr. Sandman, that the town amend Article 2.2 of the town's general bylaws relating to the advisory committee, as you will, as set forth in the motion over to page 4 of that supplement. Mr. Bassett moves and Mr. Vitolo seconds the amendment found on the blue supplement to provide that at least one elected town meeting member shall be appointed from each precinct to the extent practicable, etc., in the words of that amendment, as you will hear more about when we proceed to the speakers, which we're doing. And that's moved by Mr. Bassett, seconded by Mr. Vitolo. Mr. Wyszynski.
Good evening, everybody. Neil Wyszynski, Precinct 5 for the Advisory Committee. Article 29 is a citizen petition which proposes changes to the way advisory committee members are appointed, changes in committee composition, how long they can serve, in addition to what I would describe as some technical corrections to the bylaw. The article attempts to have the appointment process be more transparent, encourage a more diverse membership, and implement some recommendations of the Brookline Fiscal Advisory Committee, BFAC. I'd like to thank the petitioners for sponsoring the article. While they are not offering a motion under the article, they did put forward some good ideas that we feel should be implemented now. With respect to committee composition, the petitioners and BFAC propose that the current requirement that a clear majority of the committee should be made up of a clear majority of town meeting members, and that requirement should be removed. This suggestion grew out of the concern that the current requirement that each precinct be represented by a town meeting member and then up to 8 at-large non-town meeting members, 1, limits the ability of the moderator to appoint a broadly diverse membership, and 2, also limits the moderator in filling skills gaps. As an example, if a precinct needs a representative, the pool of candidates is only the current up to 15 town meeting members in the precinct delegation. The advisory committee recognized the validity of these concerns, but balanced that against the desire to have a majority of the committee be town meeting members, since the committee stands in for town meeting in between sessions for fund expenditures from the reserve fund and the liability catastrophe fund. Where we landed after a couple of twists is the current motion, which ensures that a clear majority remains town meeting members and includes the Stanley Spiegel proposal that up to 10 members can be at large, up from 8 currently. Also, while all precincts should have a resident on the advisory committee to ensure geographic representation, 12 of the precincts need to have town meeting members as their AC representative. This, we feel, provides a good balance of town meeting member representation in the committee, geographic representation, while giving the moderator some additional discretion to broaden the diversity of the committee, having sufficient latitude to fill skills gaps. Not before you is the establishment that was in the original motion of a 3-person candidate review panel to act as a gatekeeper to the committee appointment process. It would have recommended candidates to the moderator and implement extensive procedures, potentially taking months, if the moderator didn't agree with the recommendation. Advisory committee members were concerned that this shifted the appointment process from an elected moderator to a committee where the majority of its members were appointed by the select board, thus violating the carefully constructed separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches of government. The process proposed was also very prescriptive for a bylaw and time-consuming. We also noted the moderator has already implemented an application process and appointed a screening committee to assist him in recruiting candidates. Let's see how these changes work before proposing changes to the bylaw. As I mentioned, there are a number of technical corrections. The most important is allowing the advisory committee some discretion not to report on articles that don't have a financial impact on the town, such as articles expressing town meetings' views on matters of United States foreign affairs, or even impeaching the president, as has happened. These matters are where the advisory committee may not add anything to the debate. Having a finance committee is a requirement of state law for towns of our size. It serves you as town meeting members by presenting the town budget and also researching warrant article issues, presenting you with pros and cons and a recommendation. We also try to work with petitioners in perfecting warrant articles. You can take our recommendation or not. Being on the committee is a lot of work. It's a significant time commitment, and I would encourage anyone willing and able to dig in, do the work, research the issue, work with town departments and petitioners, and spend the time writing, preparing, and presenting to apply for membership. Let's put the recruitment committee and the new application process to work. So, with a vote of 20-2, with 4 abstentions, the advisory committee recommends favorable action on the motion before you. The committee also considered the Bassett Amendment, which maintains the town meeting composition of the membership status quo. The vote to modify the motion to include the Bassett motion failed by an 11-12 vote. Thank you.
Mr. Bassett. And I have not been informed of anybody who's wishes to speak from the select board. So If someone has been designated for that purpose, please send a message to the chat monitor. Mr. Bassett.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. John Bassett, Precinct 6. This is a wording change that I think is important. It, as Mr. Wyszynski has just said, it keeps the requirement insofar as practicable that there be a town meeting member from each precinct on the advisory committee. It's important because it works both ways. Information comes through that town meeting member from the precinct to the advisory committee. And our experience in Precinct 6 has been that having one of our town meeting delegation on the advisory committee has been always helpful when we're reviewing, as we almost always do when we're reviewing articles for town meeting. The proposal before you actually represents a significant change, an important change. It makes more likely the situation that as many as 4 precincts will not have a town meeting member on the advisory committee. That's a significant change. Mr. Gadsby and the previous moderators have tried and successfully and succeeded in almost always having a town meeting member from each precinct on the advisory committee. In the event, the phrase insofar as practicable is in there. It's possible that nobody will be willing to serve in a precinct delegation. In that case, somebody else can be appointed. But I think this is important enough so that if this amendment fails, I will myself vote against the main motion, which will return the appointment requirements to the present situation, where we will continue to have a town meeting member from each precinct on the advisory committee. Other aspects of this can be revisited in the spring, but I think this is an important and should be a basic requirement of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cunningham. Okay, Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Neil Gordon, Precinct 1 Town Meeting member of the Advisory Committee. There was a lot of discussion in the Advisory Committee and Subcommittee on this particular article. Let me say that I support the Bassett Amendment. I believe that representation of a town meeting member where practicable from every precinct is important. I recommend favorable action. And beyond that, I will probably vote no action should the Bassett Amendment fail. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Deborah Brown.
Yes, Deborah Brown, town meeting member, Precinct 1. I was an original co-petitioner to the original motion, which did not get the kind of support that it needed from AC. The conversations, discussions went backward and forward, back and forth. My reason for saying this is that what we were trying to do was to build in a level of transparency and I guess collaboration in a review process that really, it doesn't really exist. If you're looking at most boards and commissions, you've got 5 select board members who get to discuss what they think are the relative merits of an individual. I'll personalize this. I applied twice for AC. never received a formal interview, but was rejected. And if I hear another person say that we're clamoring for more diversity on these committees, I think I'll just have a really good chuckle. People can make whatever decisions they choose to, but let's not hide behind the fact that what we tend to do as a group is to perpetuate a status quo. And I'm not sure that what we have before us is going to do anything other than that. And that was the reason for bringing 3 people who arguably didn't have a dog in the fight to actually go through a screening process. So I'm going to vote no on the Bassett amendment, although John, I appreciate your introducing.
Thank you, Mr. Sandman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Moderator. Mike Sandman, Chair of the Advisory Committee and Town Meeting Member, Precinct 3. I do want to point out to people who are concerned that that there be a town meeting member from each precinct, that when we put out a request or put out an email to on the town meeting members website, asking for people to fill out a form if they had an interest in joining the advisory committee, I received back precisely 3 completed applications, one of which was from someone who's not a town meeting member. So as much as I understand the idea that the concept that there should be a town meeting member from each precinct, let me just say it's not easy to find people to do this work. It requires a substantial commitment. And to the extent that we can broaden the pool, each time there's a vacancy, we will have a better choice, a better opportunity to fill seats with people who are interested and qualified. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Frawley.
Regina Frawley, Precinct 16. When I researched the advisory committee membership about 15 years ago, maybe a little more, I believe that there were court cases that said you could not prevent an employee from serving on an advisory or a fiscal committee of a community. Has that been overturned? However, what disturbed, the reason that some of us were concerned about it was sometimes that person would vote on her own budget for her job, and that should have been recused, and it never was, no matter how many complaints we made. So the question I hope town council will answer is it not in fact legal for employees to serve on the advisory committee? Thank you.
Bylaw provides, so provides.
I beg pardon?
Bylaw, that's what the bylaw provides. It's correct. It was construed for the purposes of the example that you're citing as applying only to town employees rather than school employees. Mr. Karen?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. John Karen, town meeting member from Precinct 12, former member of the advisory committee many years ago. I just want to speak very briefly in support of Mr. Bassett's amendment. The Bassett amendment simply says that to the extent practicable, the advisory committee should have a representative who's a town meeting member from each precinct. If, as Mr. Sandman says, that is not possible, then obviously the goal would be to at least have a representative, as it sets forth, from each precinct. But the accountability and responsiveness to the voters is called democracy. People come out and vote for us in our precincts, and a precinct is, I think, ill-served if the people who are voted for, who are the elected representatives of that precinct, don't have the opportunity to serve on the advisory committee. So I'm undecided as to how to vote if Mr. Bassett's motion fails, but I think that every precinct is entitled, and every voter in every precinct who came out to a town meeting election and voted is entitled to have one of their town meeting members on the advisory committee if they're willing to, if there is at least one town meeting member from a precinct that's willing to serve. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Offner.
Sure, just following up on Mr. Stanman's assertion that it's really hard to find people.
Who are you, sir?
Mike Offner, Precinct 12. Following up on Mr. Stanman's assertion that, well, it's just hard to find people to serve. When Deborah Brown's, that really just crushes people's faith in the appointment process. And when the AC continues to take the positions that it does in so many warrant articles, just seeming to continually be against progressive change no matter what, it just destroys people's faith in the AC, and it destroys people's desire to participate on a committee and in a process that just seems to repeatedly defend the status quo no matter what, even in the face of a mountain of evidence of systemic and institutional racism across the town. And that is why more people are not responding to a call for applicants. People don't trust the appointment process, and people don't trust the advisory committee. And if you want to change that, you have to fundamentally change the conduct of the people involved in assembling and managing and participating in the advisory committee itself. That's all. Thank you.
Ms. Bernard.
Lauren
Lauren.
Bernard, Precinct 8. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
I wanted to follow up on what Mike Salmon said as well. In the 8 years I've served on town meeting, I've never seen, nor is just a run of the mill Brookline resident, I've never seen a request from the advisory committee to apply. Could we perhaps ask Mr. Salmon to elaborate on that, and if perhaps Mr. Lynn Jones as well, or perhaps Mr. Moderator, you're the person who asks people to apply, because I've never seen a request for application. Thank you.
Mr. Sandman, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, thank you. We created, or I created a form for people who have an interest in being on the advisory committee, and I believe I'm correct in saying that it was distributed to the TMMA listserv as an attached file sometime in the last couple of months. I'd have to go back and look and see, probably the last 6 weeks. I have to go back and look and see for the exact date. But I realize that there's a lot of stuff that passes over the TMMA listserv, and it was there, Ms. Bernard.
Thank you, Ms. Pelkey.
Yes, hello, Linda Olson-Pelkey, town meeting member, Precinct 2. I just had a question about the wording in the Bassett amendment. It says that one member shall be appointed from each precinct. And then the next sentence says at least one committee member shall be a resident of each precinct. So when I read that, that says to me that 2 people from each precinct will be appointed, 1 a town meeting member and 1 a resident. And what am I missing?
You're not reading that correctly.
Okay.
That is if you have a town meeting member from a precinct, that satisfies the condition of the second sentence, is the way I read it. Ms. Roberts?
Thank you, Susie Roberts, Precinct 2. I'm here to support the Bassett Amendment also, and quite honestly, I had the same question as Linda just now, because I wasn't sure how to read it as well. But just my point is that I too think it's important to have a town meeting member from each precinct to the extent that that can happen. I was a representative for Precinct 2 for a year. But I also wanted to address the fact that the application process certainly isn't well known. And to the extent that the AC needs to market itself to get a wider, I guess, invitation out there to be responded to, I think that's what should be done, and perhaps send a letter to all of us TMMs rather than on the listserv, because as we know, the listserv can get a little dizzying sometimes and things are definitely missed. And I'm sure that at least as a result of this conversation, there seems to be perhaps more interest than the 3 people that had responded. So I would urge that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ananian.
Hello, I just have a simple question for Mr. Salmon.
Who
How
are
many,
you?
sorry, Scott Ananian,
Who are
town
you?
meeting member from Precinct 10, which may be relevant. Mr. Salmon, how many precincts are currently lacking a town meeting member representative? The current bylaw says that every precinct must have a TMM representative. I don't believe that's the case currently. Could you?
15 of the 16 precincts are represented by town meeting members.
I don't think that's
And
correct.
there is a currently, and there's a at-large member that resides in precinct 10. Mr. Toefl?
Hi, Mike Toefl, Precinct 8. A quick question on the wording. This is for the advisory group. In section 2.22, and some of the underscored language that's being added, it says subsequently members shall be appointed for 2-year or 3-year staggered terms. And I'm wondering who decides whether it's a 2-year or 3-year term? And that's one question. The second question is also for Michael Sandman, who mentioned earlier about the advertisements that he does for members, for calls for membership. And I'm wondering what happens when a current member has their 2- or 3-year term expire and they're up for reappointment. Is there a process where you reach into the precinct to ask if anyone else is interested? Or is the person pretty much automatically reappointed without seeking other candidates? Thank you.
Well, the answer to your first question is that I determine the whether it's a 2- or 3-year term, and the reason for that flexibility is because I try to balance the committee so that 1/3 of its members have terms that expire each year, and to keep that balance, I sometimes have to appoint people for a 2-year period instead of a 3-year period. I'll let Mr. What? Who? Yeah, Mr. Ananian.
I do apologize, but I believe Precinct 9 also does not have a currently serving TMM on the AC.
Well, so be it. I'm not aware of that. So, Mr. Sandman, can you respond to Mr. Toefl's second question?
Right. So the question about, well, what happens when somebody's term expires? To be perfectly honest, we are just getting started with this concept of having an application, formal application process, and a committee to advise the moderator on who's applied and make recommendations. So that remains to be determined, remains to be seen. As a practical matter, what normally happens in all town committees is that unless there's some particular reason for a person not to be reappointed, they do tend to be reappointed. That may be good or bad, but there's every reason to assume that if we're going to have an open and transparent process and want people to, we'll want people to reapply. But that, again, it's a process that remains to be worked out. With Precinct 9?
Yeah, I can respond to that, Mr. Sandman. We had a resignation recently. The Precinct 9 town meeting member resigned, and I did not want to fill that position until I saw the what happened to Article 29. And we're deciding that right now. And after town meeting acts on Article 29, I will take the necessary steps to fill the vacancy that that resignation created. So you're right, Mr. Ananian, there is a vacancy currently in Precinct 9. Mr. Bassett?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I want to try to explain the reason for the second sentence in my amendment. As the moderator said, the requirement of the second sentence is met if the requirement of the first sentence is met. That is, if there is a town meeting member appointed from that precinct, that meets both requirements. The reason for the second sentence being included is that if there is not a town meeting member available or appointed, that there still be at least one resident from every precinct. That's the reason for the second sentence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karen.
I got.
I'm sorry, Mr. Klein.
I got nothing. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, but I said
No.
my piece.
No, I'm sorry. I misread Mr. Klein.
Yes, Jonathan Klein, Precinct 10. I have a question. My understanding is that there is not a town meeting member representative on the AC from Precinct 10, and that Scott Ananian, who appears to me to be highly qualified, has applied for that position. So I don't understand the failure to comply with the requirement that there be a town meeting member when there are qualified applicants in line.
Well, Mr. Klein, I've just tried to explain that I was waiting to fill that vacancy until I saw what happened to Article 29. And if Article 29 is passed by town meeting, I will seek advice from the committee that I have appointed to advise me and with respect to vacancies and proceed accordingly. Ms. McLellan?
Nicole Mcclellan, town meeting member, Precinct 11. It seems that some of the confusion comes about because we're sort of piecemeal trying to remedy several issues that people have identified. But one of the crucial ones seems to be just simply the application and appointment process and the lack of transparency and clarity around that. So I'm looking through all these amendments offered by the advisory committee and trying to figure out if anywhere embedded in there, there's any sort of commitment to improving the transparency and clarity of that application and appointment process to advisory committee.
Thank you. We're ready for a vote. Point of order. Mr. Banka.
Thank you. I
Turn off your television.
I hesitate to raise a point of order that may not be a point of order, but I actually think it is. The paragraph that Mr. Bassett proposes to amend on the blue sheet does not include the language that the advisory committee added from the Spiegel amendment on page 2 of the yellow supplement. And that's the sentence: the number of committee members who are not town meeting members shall not exceed 10. And I don't know whether that is inadvertent. If the Bassett amendment passes as presented on the blue sheet, that added sentence would disappear. And I don't know whether that's Mr. Bassett's intent or not, or whether it would be a friendly amendment to leave that language in, that sentence relating to committee members not exceeding 10. Thank you.
My guess is that it's not Mr. Bassett's intention. It is his intention to add the first two, to change the first two sentences, first sentence of the that paragraph to the two sentences that he leads off with in his amendment. Is that correct, Mr. Bassett?
Yes, it is, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. All right. Ms. Ms. McLellan?
Hi, Nicole Mcclellan, Precinct 11. My question was a question
I'm sorry.
for someone to
ask your
answer.
question.
My question about whether any of these amendments or the advisory committee motion includes anything about improving the transparency of the process. Can
Well, I
somebody?
think that's in the eyes of the beholder, is it not?
No. As others have received answers to their questions, I would love if either Mr. Sandman or you could answer.
Well, Mr. Brzezinski. I was not the drafter of this.
The bylaw does not, but we have a commitment from the moderator to institute a new process with a screening committee, a recruitment committee to assist them. So the plea in my speech was to let's see how that process unfolds.
Okay, Ms. Zimmerman.
Hi, yes, Amanda Zimmerman, Precinct 8. I just wanted to follow up on that point because I think it's an important one. And I know it's not currently in any of the versions being debated, but I would love to hear maybe Mike Sandman's attempt at things that we can do to increase both the applicant pool as well as making sure that reapplications are actual reapplications. And increase transparency about the process. If there's been any discussion of like, I don't know, 10 people applied and 2 got admitted for spring starting in July. You get what I'm saying. I'm not sure exactly what that would look like, but I think any sort of publicized process would give a lot more people faith in the advisory committee system.
Well, Mr. Sandman.
Well, I agree with the general tenor of concern and questions about the having a transparent process. The process has not been particularly transparent for, really wasn't designed for transparency. And in the last several years, we've had increasing concern about that, increasing interest in transparency. I think some of that comes from a growing lack of trust in government in general, government at all levels. And as a practical matter, we need to respond to that. If we're going to, certainly we need to, if we're going to restore trust. And so the only thing I can say to you is we have on the advisory committee side, a determination to demonstrate transparency. And there's a small committee that's going to be advising the moderator, and we have to work out exactly how we're going to make our own procedures obvious and open to the public. But on the one hand, we don't want to give you a list of 6 people who've sent in expressions of interest and one person, select one person and have you assume that there's something wrong with the other 5. That would be really quite unfair. So we have to figure this out. And as Mr. Wyszynski said, we'd really like some time to do it.
Well, I have just one more person, Mr. Gray. We'll hear from Mr. Gray and then proceed to vote without the necessity of calling the question. Jesse
Thank you,
Gray.
Mr. Moderator. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'd like to speak from the heart tonight because we all know that the advisory committee functions much like subcommittees and committees in our own United States Congress. And that is, the advisory does a lot of the work that we're unable to do because of the unwieldiness of town meeting. And we also know that the advisory committee is not a perfect stand-in for our values. We know that advisory committee is not representative of income diversity in this town. It's not representative of racial diversity, age diversity, and it's not representative of the imperative to take action on climate, to take action to combat systemic racism. It is not representative of the values of town meeting. And I urge you to stand with me in opposing playing with the deck chairs on the Titanic here. We should wait for real action that brings advisory into line with the values of town meeting, tweaking and making minor modifications when there is so much at stake here. We send article after article back to committee. We refer article after article because they don't meet our technical standards. They don't rise to the occasion of having had enough scrutiny to survive technical analysis. And we ought to send this back because it does not speak from the heart. This is not enough. This does not rise to the occasion, and this does not enable this town meeting to take the leadership that we need to take on climate, on race, and on so many other issues. I urge you to stand with me to call for greater action from the advisory committee and the moderator. Thank you.
All right, we're ready for a vote. First on the Bassett amendment, which is to replace the first sentence of the first full paragraph on page 2 of supplement number 3 with the first 2 sentences of Mr. Bassett's amendment on the supplement number 2. All right, the voting period has commenced. It's on the Bassett amendment. Has elapsed. Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Ms. McNally?
McNally, yes.
And Mr. Dewart?
Dewart, yes.
The vote, please.
144 yes, 61 no, 14 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 147 in favor, 61 opposed, and 14 abstentions. On the main motion, as amended by Mr. Bassett's amendment, this is main motion. Voting period has commenced. Voting period has elapsed. Mr. Jones?
Jones, yes.
Ms. McNally?
McNally, yes.
Mr. Dewart?
Dewart, yes.
155 yes, 52 no, 10 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 158 in favor, 52 opposed, and 10 abstentions. We now turn to Article 30. The motion offered under Article 30 is on page 30-4, moved by Mr. Gordon, seconded by Ms. Heller, that it's a motion concerning the recording of votes by the advisory committee. The advisory committee offers an amendment found on supplement number 1, which did not get mailed to you, but was posted on the website and distributed. The motion is on page, the last page of this supplement, and it would amend only section 2.2.6 relating to recorded votes. The main motion would have the advisory committee votes appear in the write-ups on the in the combined reports. The advisory committee would prefer to have its recorded votes only appear in the minutes of its meeting. That motion is the advisory committee's motion. Amendment is moved by Mr. Sandman and seconded by Mr. Pollock. I think I said that the main motion was moved by Mr. Gordon and seconded by Ms. Heller. Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Neil Gordon, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 1, member of the Advisory Committee. At a select board meeting earlier this year, Paul Sainer said this, quote, Neil Gordon said it's fiscally conservative, unquote, or at least words to that effect. Context isn't important. What matters is that Paul Sainer, a town meeting member, the chair of EDAB, made his point using my name. Why not just a town meeting member said, or perhaps an advisory committee member said? Like the select board, you know the difference between someone said and Neil Gordon said. That's what brings me to this virtual podium tonight. Articles calling for the advisory committee to record and report its members' votes were offered in 2002 and 2010. The pro arguments from long and longer ago remain familiar. Town meeting has the right to know how the members of its principal standing committee voted. The vote of each member of the advisory committee provides additional information for each town meeting member. This change in the bylaws would further increase transparency and help town meeting to make the best decision possible. 10 years ago, an article petitioned by then town meeting member Tommy Vitolo failed on a close vote. But since then, and we heard this in the last article, our expectations regarding transparency have changed. As town meeting members, 3 of our select board members voted no action the last time. This time, they've joined with their colleagues in unanimous support of petitioner's article. Even the advisory committee now agrees that their vote should be recorded. But as you'll hear in just a bit, they'll be offering an amendment to exclude their votes from the combined reports. The advisory committee will report them, but only in their minutes, or perhaps voluntarily in some other form on the town website. The advisory committee argues that their method of disclosure is not only sufficient, but that it's better. They argue that you'll be distracted or misled by disclosure of votes in the combined reports. I say this, the argument for transparency speaks for itself. And if and when you feel especially distracted or misled, just look away. The combined report should show how I and my advisory committee colleagues vote on warrant article recommendations. You have a right to know and a right to have it front and center in the combined reports. In the interest of transparency and of good government, please vote no on the advisory committee's amendment and favorable action on the main motion on Article 30. Thank you.
Mr. Pollock. P-O-L-L-A-K.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Article 30 changes the requirement. Excuse me, David Pollock, Precinct 11, and speaking for the advisory committee.
Thank you.
Article 30 changes the requirement for the advisory committee to make reports and recommendations to town meeting on all articles to a requirement that the committee make reports or recommendations. And this wasn't pointed out yet to you. It's actually a very important part of the warrant article. This relieves the committee of the obligation to make a recommendation on articles that do not have a significant bearing on town finances or operations. As Neil just pointed out, the article also requires that the advisory committee take roll call votes on matters of substance, not on procedural matters, and report the roll call results to town meeting. Petitioner's motion would require the reporting of roll call votes in the combined reports. The advisory committee amendment would require that they be included only in the committee's minutes, which are available to the public on the town's website. On the first issue, changing the requirement from reports and recommendations to reports or recommendations, both the petitioner's motion and the advisory's amendment are the same. The or provides some flexibility to the committee and also aligns the town's bylaw with the language in the corresponding Massachusetts statute. The advisory committee would still be required to consider all warrant articles, hold hearings, but it could decide whether to make a recommendation to town meeting or just a report. Some members of the advisory committee spoke strongly in favor of continuing the practice of making recommendations on all warrant articles. Other members pointed out that the committee will still be free to do so, and a majority of the committee voted in favor of this change. On the second issue, whether to require recorded votes on all matters of substance and where to publish those results, advisory had a long and detailed discussion. As recently as November of 2019, the committee voted almost 2-1 against reporting roll call votes. However, the committee has now accustomed itself to recording all votes under the remote meeting requirements, and no one on the committee took issue with continuing this practice. Members spoke in favor of recorded votes as a welcome measure of greater transparency. Nonetheless, many committee members believe that including the roll call votes in the advisory committee's pages of the combined reports is not in town meeting's best interest. Their concerns include the following. Prominently featuring the voting detail may encourage some town meeting members to focus on how individual members voted rather than on the substance of the advisory committee's analysis and report. Advisory committee often spends weeks exploring warrant articles with petitioners, staff in both subcommittee and full committee, and the reports provide detailed reviews of that work. Similarly, any recommendation made by the advisory committee represents the end point of what is often a long process that can include a whole series of votes on substitution, amendment, and reconsideration. Often members will vote for or against a whole series of options before voting on a final version. All of that detail is provided in the vote tally sheets that are currently posted on the town's website. And Vice Chair Carla Benka sent a link to that, I think, over the weekend or earlier today to town meeting, and I hope some of you had a chance to review those. If only the final vote is reviewed by town meeting members, they're getting a highly detailed but incomplete picture of the vote. The advisory committee is a public body accustomed to meeting, discussing, debating, and voting in public. However, the recorded vote intensifies the political spotlight on the work of the advisory committee and its members, and this may have a paradoxical effect of suppressing votes. This may already be happening as evidenced by the significant number of abstentions that are being recorded in advisory committee votes, and that's all apparent in the tally sheets that you can click on. In consideration of these concerns, the advisory committee recommends favorable action on warrant Article 30 as amended by the AC by a vote of 16-4 with 8 abstentions.
Thank you, Ms. Heller. Ms. Heller?
Thank you. Thank you for unmuting me. This is Mr. Moderator. Thank you. This is Nancy Heller speaking for a unanimous select board. We considered the arguments on this issue, and we came down on the side of the AC. I think for a couple of reasons. One is David Pollock is correct. There are many votes. They vary. There are votes about amendments and friendly amendments and motions to not vote on certain things. And I think that it's important that the public be able to see that in the minutes, which are much more, provide much more information for people who are seeking that information. So therefore, there's much greater transparency and understanding of the positions of various advisory committee members. And for that reason, we support the concepts that Mr. Gordon has put forth in his warrant article, but we do support the advisory committee's amendment. Please vote favorable action on the advisory committee amendment to the article. Thank you.
Mr. Sainer? You have to unmute yourself, Mr. Sainer. Oh, we can't hear you. I'm sorry. You're on mute. No, we still can't hear you, Mr. Sainer. Sorry. Ms. Pelkey?
Yes, thank you. Linda Olson, Pelkey, Town Meeting Member Precinct 2. I support the petitioner's version of Warrant Article 30 that calls for the advisory committee to publish roll call votes along with their recommendations to town meeting in the combined reports. The advisory committee amendment would instead publish roll call votes in their minutes. This amounts to a barrier to transparency, requiring an extra effort to look up the votes, which may actually be published too late to aid in town meeting deliberations. Another complication is that the person looking up the vote tally will need to know which minutes are for the date that corresponds to the warrant article vote you are interested in, likely resulting in a laborious trial and error reading through the various vote tallies. Transparency is a virtue, and knowing how AC members voted is no exception. I see no reason why town meeting members should not have this knowledge. It may lead us to inquire as to the reasons for particular individuals' vote. Heck, we might even appreciate a point of view we had not considered. It's all just more information, helping us to make better decisions at town meeting. Please vote no on the advisory committee amendment and yes on the original petitioner's motion. Thank you.
Mr. Sandman?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Mike Sandman, Chair of the Advisory Committee, Town Meeting Member from Precinct 3. Our intent is to provide roll call results to you in some easy to access form, whether or not Mr. Gordon's version is the one that you pass or the Advisory Committee's amendment. Last night I spent an hour or so working on how we could consolidate the votes of substantive votes of 29 voting members on 40 plus articles into one easy to digest summary. And I found out that it doesn't fit on one or even two pieces of paper, at least not in a form that you could read without a microscope. This fall, we posted a summary of all the warrant articles and a consolidated list of advisory committee hearings and minutes in one easy place to access up on Google, on docs.google.com. And that seemed to work, although I realized that you had to have the link, had to know what the link was, and we publicized that link as best we could. So the next step with advisory committee vote data is to post the information in a similar way on that same platform. Again, whether it's the advisory committee amendment or Mr. Borden's version. As long as I'm chair, you will have that information available in an easily accessible form.
Thank you, Ms. Gilman. Mr. Sainer, we'll try you again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hallelujah. Thank you. Paul Sainer, Precinct 13. David did a great job summarizing the non-controversial component of this warrant article, which was a sensible BFAC recommendation, discretion pursuant to state law with respect to which warrant articles they do a report on. The other issue has been a personal issue for me going back a decade when Tommy's attempt to have recorded votes failed. Now completely blind due to a retinal degeneration. Back then, I had just lost my ability to recognize people, and so I felt very disadvantaged going to advisory committee meetings, not knowing how people voted. And Harry Boers and his successors, Sean Lynn Jones and now Michael, have been very accommodating to me. So now we're in a virtual world where recorded votes are very commonplace to us all. And so I, as the co-chair of EDAB, want to point out that we have recently begun publishing our votes, and I think that every board and commission should be doing the same. We live in an era of heightened transparency. However, in my opinion, there's no transparency without reasonable access. The proponents article puts the advisory committee votes in the place that most of us routinely access, the combined reports. And it's very relevant to me from time to time to look to see how individuals did vote. The alternative turns into a research project going to as many as 16 different meeting minutes. That's how many meetings that the advisory committee has had, ramping up to this town meeting, and then searching through those for the final vote that corresponds with what's in the combined report. Oftentimes, using Article 27 as an example, advisory votes certain warrant articles multiple times. So in my opinion, regardless of your visual acuity, there's no reason why we shouldn't have the most reasonable access, and that is these votes published where we would access them routinely. I want to thank Neil for advancing this warrant article, and I urge everyone to vote in favor of the proponent's version. Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Sainer, we did hear from Mr. Sandman that he's going to publish the final votes on all warrant articles in a single place in reasonably accessible form, he says.
Yeah, but that's
Ms. Gilman. Ms. Gilman.
Jane Gilman, Precinct 3. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I just want you to know that sometimes when you recognize us, we are unable to unmute ourselves for a period of time, and that may account for some silence by some of town meeting members. Jane Gilman, Precinct 3 again. I'm a little troubled about language that purports to represent what's in town meeting's best interest, or language that seems to think that we will be confused by learning the votes as they came down through AC. I also am a little troubled by not putting them in the combined reports, because I think that's where they belong, because that's what I refer to. And there, I just want to point out that posting things on the town website is a huge obstacle. The website is very difficult to navigate, and even if you know that stuff is there, it's very difficult to find, for me at least. So I feel that placing the burden on me as a town meeting member to dig around and find the information is not in the best interest of town meeting. And that I really strongly encourage people to vote in favor of the proponent's proposal and not in favor of the advisory committee's motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karen.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
You're fine.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moderator. John Karen, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 12. I'd want to speak in favor of Mr. Gordon's motion as he submitted it. How people voted is important information that helps us, particularly if it follows the write-up in the combined reports so we can see if we're missing something. Just as if I'm reading a news story about a proposed bill in Congress and it tells me that Bernie Sanders says it's a good idea, but Mitch McConnell doesn't like it. That's not all the work I have to do, but that's valuable information. And if I know who on the advisory committee, and we all know after a while that certain people have certain points of view and we can respect them, but if Neil Gordon is in favor of something, that tells me something. If Harry Boers and Neil Wyshynski are also in favor of it, tells me something. If my friend, who I like a great deal but sometimes disagree with, Harry Friedman, agrees with all of them, that tells me something. And the point isn't that that's the only way you should make a decision, but that it's valuable information. We spent a lot of time talking about how to make the advisory committee more transparent, how to open up the appointment process. We all appreciate what important work and decisions are made there. Let's give ourselves the best information and make them as transparent as we want the rest of town to be. So I'm in favor of the motion as Mr. Gordon drafted it. And I served on the AC and I was not afraid to let people know what I thought, maybe ad nauseum. Thank you, Mr. Moderator and my colleagues.
Mr. Toefl. Well, Mr. Sainer, did you have something to add? Your time was up. But if you have something important to add to what you had to say, I'll listen to it. All right, well, Mr. Toefl. Mr. Toefl, you might have to unmute yourself. Oh, there
Well,
we
I
are.
was just unmuted. Yes, thank you. Mike Toefl, Precinct 8. So I'm disappointed that in the turn of events, I was very pleased to see the petitioner's motion, and I thought that AC and Select Board were in favor of its original version. I haven't followed all the conversations to now learn that in fact they're not in favor of putting the votes, the named votes, in the combined report. I've been Googling since we began this discussion to try and find the minutes of advisory that have clear articulations of when we were talking about which vote and looking for the votes. I found them separately. It's a mess. We all know what a mess the town website is. So the initial opposition to recorded votes was it would slow things down. Now that we have gotten the hang of it, it's not slowing things down by much. Now the opposition seems to be, it's going to lead people to abstain if people see their votes. Well, if that's the case, I think we need to revisit who's on advisory if they're not willing to stand behind the votes that they're being asked to take. On the one hand, our town claims to be progressive and transparent and wants equal access to information. And on the other hand, we have advisory with Select Board's endorsement saying only those who can show up or who know how to navigate the website exactly the right place should be privileged with the information of who voted which way. To me, that makes no sense And I really hope that you join me in rejecting the advisory's amendment and vote in favor of the original petitioner's motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cavell.
Hi, Kathleen Cavell, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 1. I must be missing something, but I don't understand why these two proposals are mutually exclusive. I don't understand why, if Mr. Sandman and the advisory committee want their votes posted as part of their minutes, that couldn't happen at the same time as the petitioner's motion that they be part of the combined reports could also be voted. I don't understand zero-sum games in general, but I really don't understand this one. So could someone please explain to me why both cannot happen, why it's one or the other?
Well, Ms. Cavell, the advisory committee would have its votes recorded only in the minutes, not in the combined reports. Mr. Gordon's motion would have the votes recorded in the combined reports. They can still be recorded in the minutes and will be, but I hope that explains it. Mr. Gray? Jesse Gray?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Everybody's got a boss. I'd like to speak in favor of the petitioner's version of this. Everybody's got a boss. As a town meeting member, I answer to the voters. And ultimately, the advisory committee answers to town meeting. God bless the members of the advisory committee for all the hard work that they do. But ultimately, they're working for the moderator and they're working for us. And it's time that town meeting played a more activist role in managing the advisory committee. And step number one can be full transparency in support of the petitioner's motion. Thank you.
Ms. Khan? I've called on Ms. Khan.
Hi, thank you very much. So I would like to comment
Who are you?
Oh, Janice Khan, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 15. So I'd like to comment as an advisory committee member. When I vote as an advisory committee member, I vote according to the information that I've learned through the discussion. And when I come to town meeting, I pay attention to the discussions that have here. And at times, I do not vote the way I voted at advisory committee as I do as a member of town meeting. And I think that so that my vote at the AC may or may not be informative. And I think that's really important, that the AC is a discussion among 29 people. But when I come here, I'm part of a larger body and I learn more. And I like to be able to change my mind and to grow and to learn from what I'm hearing from other people in this body. And so I think it may be helpful to have it noted. I think it's fine in the minutes. I don't think it's necessarily that informative in this body. It may be different for the select board where there's only 5 votes and they may stay consistent. But I would bet that I'm not the only member of the AC who, upon hearing discussions here, decides, well, maybe I really would like to vote differently. So I'd just like to offer that. Thank you.
All right, we've had a motion for the question, but I have only one other speaker, and I'm reluctant to cut off one person. Oh dear. I'll accept the motion for the question. I have Amy Hummel and Alyssa Jones to speak, and they will not be able to speak if the motion for the question passes. So this is a motion to terminate debate. Two-thirds vote. But the voting period is over. I have a couple of people added to the list of people on the phones because apparently there's a power problem in precinct 16. So on the motion for the question, Mr. Jones?
Jones, yes.
Ms. McNally?
McNally, yes.
Mr. Dewart?
Dewart, yes.
Ms. Thal? Hit *6 and tell us how you vote, Ms. Thal. Okay, Ms. Leichner?
No.
Ms.
No.
Thal? Ms. Thal, no? Okay. *6, Ms. Thal.
Thal, yes.
Thank you. Count.
We have 135 yes, 77 no, 9 abstentions.
Motion fails to get a 2/3 vote. 139 in favor, 79 opposed, and 9 abstentions. Ms. Hummel. I have only 2 more speakers, so.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Moderator. Amy Hummel, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 12, and an Advisory Committee member. So I'm all for transparency, but I actually was one of the town meeting members that voted, or Advisory Committee members that voted against the petitioner's amendment and truly even the AC's amendment. And shortly after that vote, I think that evening, someone who had been in attendance in that meeting wanted a record on the TMMA list of who had voted against that motion or those motions. And my name was out there loud and clear, and that's fine. But the point is, it illustrated exactly the reason I voted against it. You saw how I voted, but you have no idea why. You could call, no one called to ask why I voted that way. Maybe you assume I don't want you to know how I'm voting. That would not be the case. The reason I voted against it is a reason that David Pollock made early on, is that I don't think the advisory committee, even though we can't be completely apolitical, we are not. It would be naive to think so. But I don't think it should become about personality and who we are as individuals. The committee is a committee of lots of people. Not any single one of us makes or breaks the place or the thing. And that's a good thing, right? That enriches and enlivens the conversation. So I am going to vote most likely for the advisory committee motion this evening, even though I didn't vote for it in advisory. And that's another thing to note, a point that Janice made. Sometimes our votes evolve over time, and with different bits of information we get. It's not clear cut and dried. And if you see our votes in the combined reports, I mean, we had questions tonight about differences between two very similar and related articles, which leads me to believe not everybody's reading the combined report stem to stern. The quick, easy thing to do will be look, well, who voted which way, and make assumptions about why those people voted the way they voted. And that will degrade the essence of the work that advisory and a lot of town meeting members do, who bring warrant articles and serve on other committees. And so I do think, I understand why people want to know who voted how, and that's fair. And that's why I think it should be in the notes or in the minutes if it needs to be there at all. But I think that we will muddy the waters. I think advisory committee, and I'll finish in just a second, this idea too of us coming into line with town meeting, I'm not sure that should be a goal. I think the goal should be us doing the very best work we can, reporting out all of the facts and information and perspectives. And then we vote the way we do, and you see a general sway of, is it extreme or is it a split vote? And then town meeting can ignore advisory, and they often do. But we should be tasked with doing the work, reporting out as much as we possibly can, and criticize us if we don't do that well, but not if we're not falling in line with town meeting. We don't confirmation bias is a bad thing, and we shouldn't be looking for it. We should be looking for diversity of opinion and perspective and all the information we can get our hands on, not who did what, when, where, and how. So
Please conclude.
thank you.
Thank
I'm
you.
finished.
Ms. Jonas?
Hi, I'm Elisa Jonas, town meeting member from Precinct 16 and also on the advisory committee. Actually, Amy Hummel said a lot of what I have been thinking. I realize that this vote is going to be in favor of providing all the information in the combined reports, but I really think for the purposes of town meeting, making assessments, I think it is going to be a negative as opposed to a positive, because people are going to look at how people vote instead of reading the substance of the combined reports and what the substantive arguments are. Different people have different views on different issues, and to look at how individual members of the advisory committee vote, it'll be too easy to just look at how people vote and then make your vote based on that rather than looking at the substantive issues. And I also think the advisory committee, we are human. We are also not desirous of being condemned on a town meeting members listserv. So it will likely influence how people vote. There's a lot of information that comes to the advisory committee. It never gets to town meeting. Town meeting doesn't have time to go through all the issues the advisory committee has to deal with. There's a lot of complex issues. So sometimes it might seem puzzling why the advisory committee voted a certain way. And that is because often we have some information that doesn't get to town meeting. And hopefully it's in the combined reports and that people will read the combined reports. And it's the substance that we should be having people read and not just how did people vote. So I'm assuming the advisory committee motion will not pass, but I think town meeting is going to lose out with this new approach.
Thank you, Ms. Jonas. We're ready for a vote on the advisory committee amendment. What's that? I don't see him. And I've called for a vote. This is on the advisory committee amendment, which would the roll call votes to the advisory committee's minutes. We're in the voting period. If you approve the advisory committee amendment, vote yes. If you disapprove, vote no. Voting period has elapsed. Mr. Jones?
Jones, no.
Ms. McNally? Ms. McNally?
McNally, no.
Mr. Dewart?
Stewart, no.
Dewart, no. Ms. Thal?
Thal, no.
And Ms. Leichner?
Leichner, no.
Count, please.
57 yes, 162 no, 5 abstentions.
I'm sorry, say that again.
So 57 yes, 162 no, 5 abstentions.
Motion fails by a vote of 57 in favor, 167 opposed, and 5 abstentions. On the main motion, which is the motion of Mr. Gordon on page 30-4, Okay, the voting period has started. Yes, if you favor the main motion, no, if you're opposed, and abstain if you're abstaining. Voting period has, Mr. Jones,
Jones, yes.
Ms. McNally,
McNally,
you muted yourself, Ms. McNally. Try it again.
McNally, yes.
Mr. Dewart.
Stewart, yes.
Dewart, yes. Ms. Thal,
Stahl, yes.
and Ms. Leichner.
Leichner, yes.
Have the count.
I have 198 yes, 17 no, 8 abstentions.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have 228 people remaining to the bitter end of this session out of 248 town meeting members. Congratulations. The motion carries by a vote of 203 in favor, 17 opposed, and 8 abstentions. I will now entertain a motion to adjourn town meeting until 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening, December 2. Is there a second? Motion is seconded. And let's have, all right, cast your votes. This is not a recorded vote, so period has elapsed. I think I'm not going to take votes from those on the phone because it's not going to make any difference because the vote is.
5 yes, 6 no, 2 abstentions.
Motion carries by an overwhelming vote. I adjourn town meeting until 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.